Hey there. Tonight we're exploring how geysers, railroads, and rough draft laws shaped America's national parks. The truth is, the untouched wild was expertly marketed and often cleared of its first caretakers. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise, or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. The origin story of America's national parks looks like a nature documentary directed by a railroad company. On one side, geysers, granite, and a pitch for spiritual renewal. On the other, iron rails, hotel lobbies, and a sales plan that says, "See America first." Both sides are real. That's the twist that built a system now topping 400 units across the country, with 63 bearing the elevated brand name National Park as of 2024. The scenery is stunning. The backstory is messy, money-soaked, and absolutely riveting. Start with the billboard moment. March 1st, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signs a bill creating Yellowstone National Park, setting aside over 2.2 million acres. Congress does not have a track record for turning land into sanctuaries. It has a track record for turning land into states. But then Congress sees what the Hayden survey brought back. Ferdinand V. Hayden's 1871 team returns with the receipts. Thomas Moran's massive canvases of canyons glowing like they're lit from within, and William Henry Jackson's glass plate photographs that can't be accused of exaggeration. Proof for a skeptical capital, full of men who had been warned for years by trappers spinning tall tales about boiling rivers and petrified forests. It looks mythic. It looks marketable. The Northern Pacific Railway notices both. Before anyone pops champagne for inventing paradise, the record adds context. Yellowstone is not the first time the U.S. government ring-fenced land for public use. Congress reserves Hot Springs, Arkansas, in 1832 as a federal reservation to protect geothermal springs. Yosemite's Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees are granted to California in 1864 on the condition they be preserved for public use. Frederick Law Olmsted writes a striking 1865 report arguing that scenic places exist as a right for all people. A radical idea in a country that still tolerates private toll roads and exclusive clubs doing the gatekeeping. And even Yellowstone's first claim has competition abroad. Mongolia sets aside Bogd Yule Mountain as a protected site in 1778, long before the US even imagines it exists. America's innovation is different. It's the audacity to say, this isn't a royal hunting ground. This is a park owned by the public. The myth that these places were pristine, untouched wilderness collapses even faster. Native nations lived in and stewarded these landscapes for millennia. Miwok and Paiute in Yosemite, Shoshone, Bannock, Crow, and others in the Yellowstone region. The Tukudika, sometimes called the sheep eaters, move through the high country with a knowledge of obsidian and game that outlasts empires. Even the word wilderness is doing a lot of work for a concept invented by settlers to describe a place they do not control. National parks emerge within a century that spends a lot of time discussing civilization while making a habit of displacing people who already have one. Historian Mark David Spence writes it plainly. Parks were for the public good, but the definition of public excluded native residents and often excluded local homesteaders. When eminent domain came calling, now cue the railroads, because the scenic epiphany comes with a timetable. In the 1870s and 1880s, Big Rail, Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Santa Fe. See something that artists and scientists see too. The parks are priceless, and also a priced opportunity. The Great Northern's James J. Hill builds glacier hotels in a Swiss fantasy style and sells the Rockies as the Alps without needing a passport. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe pushes Grand Canyon tourism hard enough to install entire Fred Harvey operations, complete with uniformed Harvey girls and lavish dining cars. Northern Pacific prints brochures featuring Old Faithful, like it's a character actor with perfect comedic timing. The marketing slogan is blunt. See America first. The subtext is blunter. Spend money doing it, and do it on their trains. Yellowstone's early years aren't a tranquil nature ballet. They're a fight club between poachers, souvenir hunters, squatters, and a skeleton crew of caretakers with no legal authority to enforce anything. So the U.S. Army rides in. From 1886 to 1918, cavalry troopers occupy Yellowstone's Fort Yellowstone, wear campaign hats that later morph into the Ranger flat brim look, and enforce order. In 1894, the arrest of notorious poacher Ed Howell becomes a media event, thanks to journalist Emerson Huff's expose in Harper's Weekly. Congress responds by passing the Yellowstone Game Protection Act, giving the Army and park administrators the authority to prosecute wildlife crimes. This is a turning point that makes Don't Feed the Wildlife look dainty. It's about stopping industrial-scale slaughter for hides and horns that nearly erases bison from the continent. The bison story is brutal and oddly hopeful. By 1902, Yellowstone's wild herd is down to a heart-stopping 23 animals. Park managers mix that remnant with a few bison from private herds to rebuild. A century later, the park maintains a genetically significant population that typically ranges between 3,500 and 6,000 animals. A number adjusted for range conditions and disease concerns under the interagency plan, hammered out with Montana and tribal nations. Transfers to tribes through the Bison Conservation Transfer Program accelerate in the 2010-10 and 2020s. The park, once a refuge that pushed people out, becomes a source herd returning buffalo to tribal lands. In conservation terms, that's a full-circle plot. No one scripted in 1872. Zoom to California, 1890. Sequoia National Park and General Grant National Park get created to protect giant sequoias from loggers who bragged that they could fell trees wider than city streets. General Grant later becomes part of Kings Canyon National Park in 1940. A week after Sequoia, Congress adds Yosemite National Park. California's earlier grant from 1864 remains a state park, but the surrounding high country becomes federal. John Muir, the bearded prophet of Sierra granite, writes and lobbies with an intensity that makes modern influencers look tame. He charms presidents and repels bureaucrats. He's not alone. Figures like Galen Clark, the self-appointed guardian of Yosemite, and Theodore Solomons, who helps envision the John Muir Trail, form a chorus. But Muir provides the soundtrack. Then the country invents the legal wrench that will shape the map for more than a century. The Antiquities Act of 1906. Looters have been raiding ancestral Puebloan ruins across the Southwest, hauling artifacts by the wagon load. Anthropologists like Edgar Lee Hewitt and politicians like John F. Lacey, who already has his name on the 1900 Lacey Act, limiting wildlife trade, push hard. Congress passes the Antiquities Act, allowing presidents to unilaterally designate national monuments to protect objects of historic or scientific interest on federal land. Theodore Roosevelt treats it like a speed run contest. First move, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, in September 1906. Then comes Petrified Forest in Arizona, Montezuma Castle, and, this one is underrated, Muir Woods, donated by Congressman William Kent in 1908 for the express purpose of saving redwoods and naming it not after himself, but after Muir. Roosevelt is having a moment, and the country's future geography shows it. He proclaims Grand Canyon a monument in 1908, when Congress keeps stalling on national park status. A court case, Cameron v. United States 1920, upholds the idea that a canyon can be an object, which is bureaucratic poetry, right in the middle of this conservation. Flex comes the Hetch Hetchy fight, the epic that permanently divides two schools of environmental thought. After the 1906 earthquake, San Francisco wants a reliable water supply. That supply would come from damming the Tuolumne River in Hetch Hetchy Valley, inside Yosemite National Park. Pinchot, the U.S. Forest Service chief, backs it under the credo of conservation for use. Muir calls the valley a cathedral. The 1913 Raker Act authorizes the dam anyway. The dam is built. The valley fills. Muir dies in 1914, and conservationists never forget the loss. Hetch Hetchy becomes the rallying cry that sharpened America's environmental politics. Historian Alfred Runt argues that this moment and the railroad's influence expose how the parks are always balancing scenic preservation with utility, profit, and power. Enter 1916, and the official birth of the agency. The National Park Service Organic Act declares the mission: conserve the scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife, and provide for enjoyment in a way that leaves them unimpaired for future generations. Congress funds the agency. The mission sentence becomes a tattoo for every policy fight to come. The first director, Stephen T. Mather, is a chemistry magnate who made a fortune selling borax and spends it like a park-loving billionaire determined to make a point. He recruits Horace Albright as his deputy and partner in effectiveness. They push for better roads, higher standards for hotels and restaurants, uniform signage and coherent branding. Robert Sterling Yard, a master marketer, publishes glossy volumes like the National Parks Portfolio, with images designed to melt the hearts of urban voters and their representatives. Cars change everything. Yosemite allows automobiles in 1913. Yellowstone does the same in 1915. The era of the park-to-park highway arrives in 1920. A 5,000-mile promotional loop linking 12 western parks, because nothing says American freedom like a radiator boiling over on a mountain road while a ranger in a campaign hat offers surprisingly patient help. The Park Service embraces the motor tourism wave and improves the roads, because the other option is getting left behind. It is not subtle. It is effective. Visitor numbers climb. Concessionaires make money, and Congress sees the parks as mainstream. And it is not just western scenery. Mesa Verde becomes a national park in 1906 to preserve cliff dwellings and archaeological sites. It is the first national park created primarily to save cultural heritage. In 1919, national park status finally arrives for Grand Canyon. Zion the same year, followed by the upgrade of Bryce Canyon to national park in 1928. Mount McKinley National Park arrives in 1917 in Alaska, named after a president who never went there. A century later, in 2015, the peak is restored to Denali. The original Koyukon Athabascan name, via an Interior Department order, Names change. Ideas evolve. The parks keep arriving. Uniformed guardians are changing too. Black cavalry regiments, buffalo soldiers, are assigned to protect Sequoia and Yosemite at the turn of the century, with Captain Charles Young leading in Sequoia in 1903. They build roads to Giant Forest and administer the place with discipline the nascent Park Service would emulate. In 1918, Yosemite hires Claire Marie Hodges as one of the earliest women rangers after so many men leave for World War I. These stories puncture the myth that parks were always white, male preserves. They weren't. They were often run that way, but reality was always more complicated and more interesting. Then comes the Great Depression, the darkest time that builds many of the park's visitors still walk through. Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 reorganization brings a massive expansion of NTP's responsibilities, moving dozens of battlefields, monuments, and memorials from the War Department and other agencies to NEPS. The Historic Sites Act of 1935 follows, declaring national policy to preserve historic places and authorizing surveys that eventually create a nation-spanning register. The New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps puts more than 3 million young men to work building trails, walls, campgrounds, lookouts, and parkitecture that defines the vibe. Split log beams, rough-cut stone, low-slung structures that look organic because they are. Old Faithful Inn in Yellowstone, built a little earlier in 1904 by Robert Reamer, becomes the poster child for the rustic style. The Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite, designed by Gilbert Stanley Underwood and opened in 1927, references indigenous Art Deco motifs with stone massing. That would make a Bond villain nod approvingly. CC crews extend that aesthetic everywhere. National Park Service rustic becomes a look that belongs to the landscape. The 1930s also mark the point where the Park Service fully stops being just smeary police. Eastern parks arrive, and they arrive with baggage. Shenandoah National Park in Virginia and Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina and Tennessee are created from a patchwork of private lands acquired and condemned, often from families who had lived there for generations. Great Smoky adds up through donations and state purchases, including a heroic private campaign raising funds in the midst of the Depression. John D. Rockefeller Jr. donates $5 million. The states match, and the park opens officially in 1934. The scars are real. Thousands are displaced. Segregation laws oversee separate facilities for black visitors at Shenandoah into the 1940s, with Lewis Mountain as a designated area. The Park Service, under Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, issues orders against discrimination in the 1930s, but it takes time and the broader civil rights movement to break the practice. Even the parks that promise equality at the gate have to learn it. World War II slows park development. When peace returns, America needs bigger parking lots, more than it needs new parks. Post-war road trips explode. The Park Service faces a tidal wave of visitors in the 1950s, often with 1930s infrastructure. Director Conrad Worth pitches a rescue mission with a perfect public works name, Mission 66. From 1956 to 1966, the agency spends roughly $1 billion in mid-century dollars upgrading roads, campgrounds, utilities, and building visitor centers in a modernist style that sometimes clashes with the rustic dream but handles the traffic. Rocky Mountain's Beaver Meadows Visitor Center arrives with Frank Lloyd Wright's firm on the masthead. Klingman's Dome Observation Tower in Great Smoky floats like a concrete spaceship above the spruce. Some preservationists fight back. Others recognize that bathrooms and pullouts are not optional in places receiving millions of people. In the 1950s and 60s, the parks also become the battleground for a different war. Dams. In the 1950s, a plan would put Echo Park Dam inside Dinosaur National Monument. Conservation groups lead a furious campaign. The dam is dropped from the 1956 Colorado River Storage Project, and the movement learns a lesson. Inviolable is a word that needs constant reminder. The Grand Canyon's turn comes next with plans for dams at Marble and Bridge Canyons. By 1968, those drop as well, and another line in the sand gets drawn. Meanwhile, the environmental movement reshapes the mission. Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring in 1962. The 1963 Leopold Report tells the Park Service to manage for the biotic associations that existed before major European settlement. A science-forward recommendation that basically says, stop sculpting nature to entertain and let ecosystems function. This is a pivot point that reverberates for decades. The pivot is desperately needed. Predator control in early parks had been aggressive. Wolves in Yellowstone are eliminated by the 1920s. Grizzly bears are treated like mascots fed at open dumps into the 1960s. Then, in 1967, 2 fatal grizzly attacks on the same night in Glacier National Park forced the agency into a reckoning. The tragic events, documented in Jack Olson's Night of the Grizzlies and echoed in decades of safety lectures, pushed the closure of the dumps and the end of the animal show era. By the 1990s, wolves returned to Yellowstone. In 1995 and 1996, biologists and crews released 31 grey wolves from Canada. Elk numbers shift, aspens get a break, and the park becomes a case study in trophic cascades that even high school classrooms debate. Science grows up, and the parks grow with it. Conservation also moves south and east to ecosystems that had been overlooked precisely because they lack postcard peaks. In 1947, Everglades National Park is established, the first major U.S. national park created not for mountain views, but to protect a complex wetland. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas insists in 1947 that the Everglades is a river of grass, not a useless swamp. For once, the poetry aligns with hydrology. The park fights a constant rearguard action against urban sprawl, agricultural runoff, and ambitious engineering projects. The idea that national parks protect processes, not just places, starts here. Then Alaska happens, and the entire scale of the system recalibrates. In 1978, after Congress stalls on sweeping Alaska lands legislation, President Jimmy Carter uses the Antiquities Act to proclaim 56 million acres as national monuments in one day, triggering political blowback that could power a coal plant. 2 years later, Congress passes the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, in 1980, transforming and creating parks and preserves totaling more than 47 million acres. Denali expands, Wrangell sent. Elias arrives at 13.2 million acres, larger than Switzerland, Katmai, Kenai Fjords, Gates of the Arctic, Kobuk Valley, Lake Clark, and more fill in the map. Subsistence rights for rural Alaskans become part of the law. Snow machines and traditional hunting are allowed in preserves. The Park Service, which started with geysers and a cavalry fort, now administers a land base so vast that one cannot see the end of it from a plane while chewing gum, no matter how persistent the effort. While all of that big land drama unfolds, the agency adds sites that tell the country's contested social history with a clarity often missing in earlier decades. After the 1930s transfer of Civil War battlefields, the narrative expands. The 90s and 2000s bring Brown v. Board of Education National Historical Park in Kansas, Manzanar National Historic Site in California, telling the story of Japanese-American incarceration. Pullman National Historical Park in Chicago, honoring labor and civil rights. Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. Freedom Riders National Monument. Stonewall National Monument in New York, marking a pivotal moment for LGBTQ rights, and the Medgar and Miley Evers home in Mississippi. In 2023, the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument is designated across Illinois and Mississippi. The phrase "for the benefit and enjoyment of the people," engraved on the archway at Yellowstone's north entrance in 1903, now carry stories that include the people themselves. Numbers get big in ways only a national bureaucracy can love. By the 2020 yes, the National Park Service oversees more than 84 million acres across over 420 units, ranging from archaeological sites to seashores, memorials, lakes horrors, rivers, trails, and the flagship national parks. Only 63 carry the capital brand, National Park, a designation that says more about congressional mood and compromises than scenery. Gateway Arch National Park, designated in 2018, sets a record for being the smallest of that elite group at just 91 acres, while Wrangell's St. Elias sits at the top of the size chart looking smug. Visitation hovers in the 300 million plus range most years. In 2023, NPS tallies roughly 325 million recreation visits. Great Smoky Mountains National Park leads the pack with over 13 million in 2023 alone. And the Blue Ridge Parkway, technically a separate unit, captures about 16 million. Zion, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, and Rocky Mountain each flirt with numbers in the several million range annually, depending on roadwork, pandemics, and social media trends that can clog a trail faster than a tour bus. And speaking of social media, it changes behavior so fast that policies scramble to keep up. Arches National Park institutes a timed entry pilot in 2022 to blunt the daily deluge and reduce parking lot fights that would earn viral clips. Zion restricts Angel's Landing with a permit system. Yosemite experiments with day use reservations. The Park Service tries to balance access and preservation with soft touches and then with hard caps. It isn't about elitism. It's about the fact that narrow canyon trails were not designed for a tsunami of people simultaneously performing content creation. The financial story keeps the stakes real. The Park Service runs on an annual budget hovering near $3 billion to $4 billion in appropriations, supplemented by user fees that pay for a fraction of needs. Deferred maintenance piles up for decades to a backlog running into tens of billions. Roads, pipes, historic structures, trail bridges, visitor centers that date to the Eisenhower administration or earlier. In 2020, Congress passes the Great American Outdoors Act, dedicating up to $1.9 billion per year for 5 years to maintenance across public lands and permanently funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million annually. It is a big win with a catch. The backlog is a rolling target. Every crumbling sewer line that gets fixed is a future one that still needs parts. Perfect is not on the menu. Better is. Even the branding evolves. The Park Service arrowhead emblem, adopted in 1951, becomes one of the most beloved and imitated logos in government. The sequoia and bison represent flora and fauna, the lake and mountains. The lake and mountains, the landscape, and the arrowhead itself, the historical and archaeological heritage. It is not universally adored when new. Purists complain, but by the 21st century, it's an icon. The flat brim hat that grew out of army uniform tradition completes the silhouette. Rangers become the public face of federal competence that a weary citizen might actually trust. Climate change dissolves any comfort that the system is stable by default. Glacier National Park had around 150 glaciers in 1850. By the 2010 only about 24 meet the minimum size to be called glaciers, and they are receding hard. Sea level rise pushes salt water into the Everglades and eats away at barrier islands. Joshua trees face a future that could squeeze them out of a namesake park if warming and fire trends continue. Alaska's thawing permafrost turns roads and trails into pranks. The 1988 Yellowstone fires burned nearly 800,000 acres inside the park and more beyond. A complex set of fire events that dominate the American news cycle and force a scientific re-evaluation. NPF's fire policy shifts to recognize that fire is a process, not a catastrophe. With a press conference, the logic is straightforward. Suppress every flame, and the fuel loads stack up. Let natural fires burn under controlled conditions, and the ecosystem heals as much as it hurts. The system also changes language, and sometimes the language changes first. Offensive place names get scrubbed following a 2022 Interior Department order. Yellowstone renames Mount Doyne to First Peoples Mountain in 2022 after consultations with tribes, reflecting the role of Lieutenant I. Gustavus Doane in the 1870 Marius Massacre and the decision not to celebrate that history. Denali goes back to Denali in 2015, overturning a century of political inertia in favor of original names. These moves aren't cosmetic. They signal an overdue correction in who gets honored and who gets ignored on maps. Tribal partnerships and co-stewardship agreements move from press releases to practice. The Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition helps shape management for a landscape thick with cultural sites. And while Bears Ears is managed by the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service rather than NEMPs, the precedent for co-management runs across public lands. Inside NIPIs, agreements with tribes grow in significance, from bison transfers to interpretive programs led by tribal experts. The Havasupai regain roughly 188,000 acres of ancestral land inside and adjacent to Grand Canyon, with the 1975 Park Enlargement Act, a pivotal law that recognizes residence and dispossession in the same paragraph. The country at large notices that conservation, without consultation, is a relic. Myths keep showing up for a beating from the actual record. The idea that national parks are all about mountains and waterfalls never survives a glance at dry Tortugas, a 19th century fort in the Florida Keys. Congaree bottomland, hardwood forests in South Carolina, or Carlsbad Caverns, the most jaw-dropping spelunking reward one can achieve without carrying a headlamp's weight of regret. The idea that they are static preserves collapses under invasive species removal efforts, water deals negotiated across state lines, and the relentless need to adapt to climate science. The idea that parks started pure is replaced by a story where railroad money, political will, science, and activism collide. John Muir sketches a beautiful vision. Theodore Roosevelt wields a pen like a machete. Stephen Mather sells the product with unapologetic flair. Black soldiers patrol the gates. Women hold badges. Indigenous communities pay the cost and increasingly shape the future. It's messy. It's still the best idea the United States ever had, as Wallace Stegner famously wrote, and the key word in that sentence is had, not completed. Tally the signature beats. 1832. Congress protects Hot Springs Reservation for public use. A federal first. 1864. The Yosemite Grant hands Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove to California, with the stipulation it be preserved, and Olmsted frames the public trust idea. 1872. Yellowstone becomes the first national park by act of Congress. Hayden, Moran, and Jackson deliver the visual evidence that saves a landscape. 1886, 1918. The U.S. Army manages Yellowstone and influences the ranger ethos. 1890. Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks established. The giant trees live to continue humbling everyone. 1906. The Antiquities Act passes. Roosevelt goes on a monument spree, and Mesa Verde becomes a national park created mainly for archaeology. 1913. Hetch Hetchy Dam authorized inside Yosemite over preservationist objections, cementing the conservation-preservation split. 1915. Yellowstone allows automobiles. The modern age drives in and doesn't leave. 1916. The National Park Service is born with an organic act that still reads like a mission statement written by a poet with a law degree. 1933-1935. The Roosevelt reorganization brings historic sites to NPs. The Historic Sites Act solidifies the idea that history belongs to the public too. 1930s. The CCC reshapes infrastructure with sweat and stone, leaving trails and campgrounds still in use. 1956, 1966. Mission 66. Mission 66 modernizes facilities for a car-crazy public. Interpretive rangers start telling a deeper, sometimes uncomfortable story. 1963. The Leopold Report makes ecological integrity the North Star. 1968. Wild and scenic rivers and national trails. Systems Acts add more tools, while dam proposals retreat permanently from cathedral-level scenery. 1980. Anilka redraws Alaska, establishing or expanding colossal parks and preserves with subsistence rights embedded in law. 1995. 1996. Wolves return to Yellowstone, the most famous predator management U-turn in agency history. 2020. The Great American Outdoors Act injects major maintenance money. A rare bipartisan infrastructure moment for nature. The visitor experience evolves in tandem. Lodges like the Ahwahnee and Zion Lodge wear their age well. Rustic cabins carry the smell of pine and old varnish like a family heirloom. Picnic tables have seen more birthday candles than a bakery. Fonts on wayside signs. The carefully chosen letters of a federal agency feel comforting. The first-time visitor standing at the rim of Grand Canyon does not need a lecture to understand grandeur. The person trudging up to Vernal Fall in a spray of mist, even in July, doesn't need to be told that water is a force or that gravity remains undefeated. Then the camera shifts behind the scenes again. Concession contracts get complicated and occasionally messy. Delaware North trademark spat in Yosemite over names like Ahwahnee. Reminds the country that privatization likes to leave its initials on the furniture. After a settlement, the historic names return. Rangers manage more than trails. They manage expectations, emergencies, and the occasionally feral selfie impulse. Search and rescue teams sprint into action to retrieve the person who read the internet but not the weather. The annual list of injuries is a masterpiece of human optimism. The legal vocabulary keeps getting denser because it has to. The 1964 Wilderness Act gives designated areas within parks an extra layer of don't touch, banning roads and mechanized transport. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 makes environmental review a requirement, not a courtesy. The General Authorities Act of 1970 and its 1978 Redwood Amendment clarify that the Park Service manages the whole system under the same preservation standard, a response built partly on hard lessons from Redwood National Park's boundary fights and courtroom drama in the 1970s. Redwood becomes a park in 1968 after Save the Redwoods League and others push Congress to halt the chainsaws eating into the last 5% of primeval coast redwood forest. The expansion in 1978 protects upstream logging damaged watersheds. Federal courts and Congress both get starring roles. These laws operate like rebar in concrete, invisible to most visitors, critical to keeping the structure upright. In urban America, the parks jump the fence into daily life. Gateway National Recreation Area, created in 1972, brings beaches and forts to New York and New Jersey. Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the same year, turns the San Francisco Bay's edges into a giant, complicated park. Cesar Chavez is honored in California. San Antonio Missions in Texas connects colonial history to living communities. The border between nature and city starts to look more like a Photoshop layer than a wall. With all that history, the present still refuses to sit quietly. Fires in the West get bigger in a warmer, drier climate. Visitation booms strain quiet valleys and narrow canyons. Bears learn parking lot schedules. Rangers teach leave no trace like it's a second language. And for many visitors, it is. The NP's workforce diversifies, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Tribal co-stewardship agreements multiply. The majority of Americans now live within a day's drive of a national park unit. The marketing slogan writes itself, a national inheritance hiding in plain sight. The big numbers keep flexing. According to Wanda, according to MPS public data, Blue Ridge Parkway typically hovers around 15 to 16 million visits per year. Great Smoky sits in the 12 to 14 million range. And individual parks like Zion, Grand Canyon, Rocky Mountain, Yosemite, and Yellowstone regularly rack up annual totals between 3 and 5 million visitors. In 2021, Yellowstone hits a record around 4.86 million. Pandemic travel patterns turn parks into the safe vacation option. And lines at park gates look like Black Friday outside of a big box store. Except the prize is a view and possibly an elk jam. It's both an endorsement of the original idea and a stress test of everything built since. The storyline's secret weapon is this: it never lets the hero stay one person or one cause. Early advocates like artist George Catlin floated the nation's park concept as early as 1832, imagining a protected area that preserves native cultures and wildlife. Olmsted writes, like a civic philosopher, Muir wishes to convert everyone. Pinchot asks that resources be used wisely and not wasted. Roosevelt signs papers with a flourish that still echoes in land records. Mather advertises. Albright organizes. The CC swings hammers. The environmental movement swerves politicians away from concrete in canyon shadows. The Leopold Report gets wildlife science into policy. Alaska's subsistence users insist that living traditions belong. The modern Park Service wrestles with carbon, crowds, and collaboration. The movement is a relay race, and the baton is ideas. Every park is a compromise between uses and limits. Grand Teton's story shows this perfectly. Rockefeller money quietly buys Jackson Hole ranches in the 1920s and 30s to stop development creeping toward the Tetons. In 1943, after local opposition, FDR uses the Antiquities Act to create Jackson Hole National Monument. In 1950, Congress merges the monument with the existing 1929 Grand Teton National Park, while prohibiting future parks in Wyoming without congressional approval. The park exists. The political scar tissue remains. The moral is not that compromise ruins parks. The moral is that compromise creates them, and then requires constant attention. The flip side of that compromise shows in some sorry chapters. Yosemite's Hetch Hetchy Valley drains behind concrete. Cuyahoga Valley, now a national park, used to carry a river that literally caught fire in 1969 from industrial waste. Great Smoky and Shenandoah begin with displacements that shaped family stories as much as mountain roads. National monuments get shrunk by unilateral presidential action in 2017 and then restored in 2021, showing how quickly lines can move depending on who holds the pen. Parks have always existed at the intersection of law, tourism, science, and residents' lives. That's not a flaw. That's the job description. The quiet, satisfying victories add up too. A bristlecone pine, standing in Great Basin National Park, is older than most religions and all empires. The agency protects it, humbly, because humility is the only correct posture in the presence of a tree born before the Iliad. Cabrillo looks out over San Diego's harbor and tells stories of Spanish exploration and Kumeyaay resilience. A ruin at Chaco Canyon holds astronomical alignments encoded in sandstone. A trail marker on the Selma to Montgomery route binds the past to the pavement underfoot. Effigy mounds in Iowa and Poverty Point in Louisiana preserve human engineering that predates the pyramids. The wild land idea and the human story are holding hands now. Every once in a while, the system shows a flash of comedy the creators probably did not intend. Gateway Arch National Park's 91 acres wear the crown of smallest national park with the confidence of a pocket square. The statue of Thomas Jefferson stands beneath a stainless steel parabola, and tourists ask if this is really a national park with the same tone one might use for a trick question. It is. Congress said so. The designation wars keep going. Indiana Dunes goes from National Lakeshore to National Park in 2019, igniting length of label debates across the internet. New River Gorge in West Virginia becomes a national park and preserve in 2020. Purists grumble. Locals quietly celebrate a tourism windfall. The United States has always curated its identity in public. The parks are where that curation shows. The forward edge looks a lot like the past did. Ideas fighting for space on a finite landscape. Energy development pressures creep toward park borders. Migration corridors for animals need connectivity on maps that were drawn for property lines, not hooves. Air quality in parks improves after the Clean Air Act, then suffers again with wildfire smoke as the climate warms. Funding cycles look like roller coasters. The NEP's workforce deals with the same issues every service industry does, except their office is occasionally a cliff, a jail, or a communications dead zone. And yet the agency likes to call itself America's best idea with a self-awareness that lands closer to accurate than arrogant. Visitors who think the story peaked with Yellowstone's creation learn something every time a ranger starts a talk with a sentence that begins. As the National Park Service archives show, the narratives are maturing. Interpretive signs now name the Ahwahnechee in Yosemite, not as a footnote, but as historical anchors. Exhibits at Grand Canyon amplify Havasupai voices. National monument designations focus on places central to Black, Latino, Asian American, and LGBTQ histories. The Park Service posts climate data like a scoreboard, because denial cannot live long where evidence is measured daily by snowpack, stream gauges, and thermometer. Another solid plot line is the selfish one. These places are fun. They are also weird. Devil's Tower is a volcanic plug that looks like a bundle of hexagonal pencils sharpened by gods with OCD. Bryce Canyon is an amphitheater of hoodoos that turn into a sunrise coliseum. Carlsbad Caverns offers people the chance to stare at stalactites named for draperies and chandeliers without paying a theater upcharge. Dry Tortugas is a fort marooned in turquoise water where snorkelers float above parrotfish while reading about 19th century masonry. Great Sand Dunes has a Star Wars desert backed by a Rocky Mountain skyline, a combination that makes the brain wonder if someone hit the randomizer. America's public land portfolio is eccentric in the best way. It all comes back to the idea that parks are public, not royal, not corporate, not gated with bouncers holding clipboards and deciding who's in. Public. George Catlin imagined a place where native cultures and wildlife were both valued in 1832. The government did not follow his complete vision. It chose to protect land, but not the people who made land a home. The 20th century sees that error and still mostly refuses to correct it. The 21st century tries again with coastwardship and land acknowledgements sharp enough to be more than pra. The arc is not neat or quick. It bends with grind and grit. The system's best self is collaborative. Scientists working with rangers, tribal councils with superintendents, non-profit partners funding repairs and research, volunteers clearing trails. School groups forming lifelong memories as small legs pump up hills bigger than their patience. NPPR campaigns. Save the Redwoods raises money. Historians argue in public comment periods. And Congress once in a while surprises. Unlike myth, the real story isn't a single hero. It's a chorus that really likes maps. One last slide detail. In a nation famous for commodifying everything, the parks are an anti-commodity. The value is highest when nothing is extracted. That turns capitalism on itself and gets buy-in anyway. Railroads sold tickets to get people there, to see a thing the railroads didn't own. Today's outdoor industry sells boots and tents, and snacks designed for places where nothing can be bought. The tax base pays for protection that makes people healthier, happier, and occasionally less online. A national decision to value what cannot be monetized fully, and to do that at scale, is both sentimental and stern. It says the quiet part out loud. There are limits worth loving. Stand at Old Faithful in January and watch steam freeze into diamond dust beneath a blue so sharp it cuts. Walk under redwoods at Muir Woods with a soundscape of whispers rather than engines. Drift along the Lamar Valley at dusk as pronghorns ghost past and ravens heckle the whole valley. The country founded a system to save those experiences and the places that deliver them. The paperwork is as thick as the forest. The compromises are everywhere. The myths are tattered. The reality is better, as NP's superintendents like to say when briefing the public. Stewardship is a forever job. The mission to preserve, unimpaired, for future generations, reads like a promise, written on a moving train. The past suggests it can be kept with imagination, law, art, money, and perseverance. In other words, the same ingredients that built the parks in the first place. Next, let's turn our attention to the cultural achievements of the Chola Dynasty. 1,000 years ago, while much of Europe wrangled over feudal contracts and drafty keeps, artisans in the Kaveri Delta stacked 6 million kilograms of granite into a near-perfect pyramid, crowned it with a stone finial the size of a truck, painted the walls with life-size royals, and carved the payroll into the base for anyone to audit. The Chola dynasty didn't just build a temple in 1010. It built a cultural machine, and the receipts are literally on the walls. Start at Thanjavur, 1010. C. Rajaraja's Brihadishvara temple rises 60.96 meters, 216 feet, of geometry, numbers so precise they sound like a dare. No mortar fantasies here. The structure keys itself together, block over block, gravity doing the quiet heavy lifting. The tower, the Vimana, vaults upward with such assurance that later dynasties simply stopped trying to out-Vimana it and went all in on gatehouse gopurams instead. On the ground, a fat latticed Nandi bull, carved from a single stone, lounges like it has bench-pressed dynasties. Inside, an 8.7-meter linga anchors the space with planetary calm, completely legitimate to feel small. That's the tourist moment. Then the records start talking. A marathon-length Tamil inscription chiseled along the temple's base does not spend its word count bragging. It itemizes. It names over 400 temple dancers by name. It lists the villages that sent them, the rice they received, the lamps they lit, the musicians who played alongside them, the drummers who kept time. It notes how many cows were assigned to supply ghee for the lamps, and who would be fined if the lamps went dark. It's not just liturgy, it's logistics. It is medieval hair, finance, and event management fused into sacred routine. Epigraphists went in for poetry and came out with spreadsheets in stone. Then the paint joins the story. Under later Nayaka-era overpainting, conservators in the 1930s and again in the 1980s found early Chola murals, processions, deities, and one striking portrait of Rajaraja I, hands pressed in worship, with his guru Karuva Devar, a king at human scale. This is not a distant emperor on a coin. This is a patron with a face, a body, a devotional posture, and enough swagger to commission a self-portrait in an age where piety usually hides the donor. Already, myths wobble. The crowd pleaser about hauling an 8-ton capstone up a 4-kilometer ramp gets repeated at family gatherings like the best urban legend. Archaeologists advise caution. The finial is heavy, yes, tens of tons, but probably assembled with more nuance than a single megastone performance. The point stands. The Cholas engineered big, and they engineered elegantly. As UNESCO's Great Living Chola Temples listing confirms, the Thanjavur Vimana isn't just tall, it's stable across 1,000 monsoons. But wait, that tower is only the opening riff. Rajaraja's son, Rajendra I, goes full sequel. Around 1035, he raises the Gangaikonda Kolisvaram temple at Gangaikonda Cholapuram. The translation of the city's name is unsubtle. The city of the Chola who conquered the Ganga. The Vimana is slightly lower, about 55 meters, but the sculptural language gets silkier. The profile's gentler, the curves more lyrical. If Thanjavur is granite thunder, Gangaikonda Kolapuram is granite melody. Rajendra commemorates a northern campaign by literally bringing water from the Ganges in sealed pots and pouring it into a vast reservoir known as Kolagangam. Cultural symbolism didn't require hashtags to go viral. A century later, Rajaraja II adds a flourish at Darasaram. The Airavate temple belongs in a long conversation about design. Its base is carved like a rolling chariot. The steps to the main hall, as local tradition and archaeological survey of India field notes love to point out, ring musical notes when tapped, an architectural flex and a connoisseur's toy. These three monuments, Thanjavur, Gangaikonda Kolapuram, and Dharasuram, form UNESCO's Great Living Chola Temples, inscribed in 1987 and extended in 2004. 1,000 years of maintenance, worship, and civic energy have kept them in the present tense. What made this cultural engine hum wasn't just stone, it was bronze. Liquid metal turned to divine choreography. The Cholas are the reason the world recognizes a particular image as India's Shiva as Nataraja, whirling in a ring of fire, one foot blessing the devotee, the other poised above a crushed, dwarf of ignorance. This isn't merely a statue. It is philosophy made three-dimensional, and the technique mattered. The famous Chola bronzes were cast using the lost wax method, Seer Purdue, where artisans shaped the deity first in beeswax, wrapped it in clay, fired it so the wax drained, and then poured molten metal, panchaloha, a 5-metal alloy heavy on copper, into the cavity. When it cooled, the clay was broken, revealing a one-of-a-kind image. No molds to reuse, no second try. Every icon is a first edition. This wasn't factory output. Masters like the ateliers patronized by Sembien Mahadevi, the 10th century Queen Mother whose taste left fingerprints all over the early Chola aesthetic, set up a canon of anatomy and gesture that still trains the eye. Longer torsos, elegant shoulders, the slight S-curve through the hips, the chastely opulent jewelry modelled into the wax rather than bolted on later. The result: bronzes that hold still, yet look like they might inhale. Pieces from the 11th and 12th centuries now sit in the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Government Museum in Chennai. Even CERN nods to the image. A modern bronze Nataraja stands at the physics facility as a metaphor for matter and energy in cosmic rhythm. The Cholas dreamed the form first. So why did metal matter so much? Because these images moved. Unlike stone icons, Chola bronzes were designed for processions. The temple became stage and city square at once. Lamps flared, conches sounded, drums thundered, and out came the deity, the Nataraja, the Samaskanda, Siva with Uma and Skanda. The Kalyana Sundara, Siva's wedding form, carried on palanquins through streets lined with lamps and people and hawkers selling offerings and snacks. The inscriptions record not only who carried the images, but how much they were paid in rice or gold, which days of the lunar calendar featured which procession, and who funded the oil for the lamps. The culture here does not separate art from administration. The art is the administration. That same fusion shows up in Chola literature. Tamil writing in this period doesn't exist in a cathedral of silence. It grabs a drum. Around 1000 CE, Rajaraja I sponsors the formal recognition of the Tevaram, the 7th-9th century devotional hymns of Appa, Sambandar, and Sundara, the Nyanmar saints. Tradition credits Nambi Andar Nambi with collecting and organizing the manuscripts, some reportedly discovered in a chamber at Chidambaram. Whether that discovery tale is literal or promotional myth, the effect is measurable. Inscriptions from Chola temples start referencing Udavars, trained singers maintained by the temple to recite specific hymns at specific times. The arts budget now includes music literacy. The past, those early Tamil hymns, is pulled into daily life by policy. By the early 12th century, the Periyar Puranam arrives. Sekizar composes it in the 130s under Kulotunga II. It's a massive Tamil hagiography of the 63 Nyanmars. Names become stories. Stories become ritual memory. The text is not just a bookshelf object. It sets the vibe of the temple circuit for centuries. Meanwhile, royal poets flex different muscles. Jayam Kondar writes the Kalingata Purani under Kulotunga I, celebrating a campaign to Kalinga with all the high-octane imagery expected of the Purani genre. Ottakattar composes Eula poems, imaginative processional verses about Vikrama Chola, Kulotunga Chola, and Rajaraja Shi, lacing royal biography with urban ambience. And then Kamban, in the 12th century, retells the Ramayana in Tamil, the Ramavataram, popularly called Kambaramayanam, turning an old Sanskrit epic into a Tamil epic symphony that feels local without losing cosmological muscle. By the time K.A. Nilakantha Sastry wrote the Cholas in the 1930s, the pattern was clear. These weren't one-off commissions. This was a deep bench. Even the bureaucracy wrote in verse. Many royal charters open with a makey earthy, a formulaic Tamil eulogy of the king's conquests and virtues, before getting to the dry details. The Leiden copper plates, now housed in the Netherlands, offer a stunning example of Chola cosmopolitanism on metal, dating to Rajaraja I and Rajendra I. The bilingual Tamil-Sanskrit plates record a grant to a Buddhist vihara at Nagapattinam, the Chudamani Vihara, built in 1006 by the Srivijayan ruler Sri Mara Vijayotunga Varman with Rajaraja's permission. That's a Saivite Chola king facilitating a Buddhist monastery, backed by a Southeast Asian ally. Anyone still trying to file medieval South India into neat religious silos gets these copper plates shoved under the door. It goes further. The Cholas didn't invent maritime long haul, but they turbocharged it. Rajendra's 1025 raid on Srivijaya, think Sumatra, Malaya Peninsula, shows what a Chola fleet could do when pointed like a spear. The cultural record, however, loves the peaceful side of that story more. Merchant guilds such as the Ayaval 500 and Nuravar and Manigramam left inscriptions not just in Tamil Nadu, but across the Bay of Bengal, Takuapa in Thailand, Baras on Sumatra's west coast, even as far as Burma. Their Tamil names and signatures loom in stone. These are organized, wealthy collectives with their own seals, rules, and philanthropic styles. Zhao Rugu's 1225 Chinese compendium Jufan Ji mentions Julian, almost certainly, Chola country, noting trade goods and emissaries. Song Dynasty records show a Chola embassy in 1077. Porcelain shards from China wash up in Nagapattinam. Tamil coins show up in Sri Lanka. It's not just spice talk, it's town-building money. Back home, that money underwrites a civic culture that looks oddly modern. The Uttaramaru inscriptions from the time of Parantaka I, 919-920. 1 Sir. Detail a village self-government system that epigraphists keep bringing up because it ruins every simplistic timeline about democracy. They spell out the coup de volet method. Ballot by pot. Candidates for the village sabres committees had to meet criteria. Age between 35 and 70. Knowledge of sacred texts. Ownership of specified amount of land. Tax compliant. Free of major moral or financial offences. Not previously serving in the last term. Names were written on palm leaf slips, dropped into a pot, and drawn in a public ritual. The committee handled irrigation, temple maintenance, land assessment, and more. Disqualifications got listed with the same chilly fairness as the pay scale for temple drummers. It's not parliament, it is governance. And it shows competence with rules. Education shows up on stone, like a budget line. The Inaram inscription of Rajendra period records a Salai, a residential Vedic grammar college, with hundreds of students and multiple teachers, endowments for meals, and precise allocations of land revenue to fund the school. Other inscriptions at places such as Tirumakudal, near Kanchipuram, go granular on healthcare. A Lom stone text from the reign of Veera Rajendra, 1063-1070, lays out an North Arasalai hospital attached to the temple. 15 beds, staff positions including physicians, nurses, barbers, water carriers, even the potter tasked with making the vessels, all with salaries in coins or kinds. a pantry list of medicines from ghee to betel and long pepper, and fines for negligence. This is a temple hospital. But the word that keeps surfacing is systems. Systems need infrastructure. The Kaveri Delta blooms with tanks and canals. Vietnam Lake, attributed to Rajendra I's era and extended by later rulers, still supplies water to modern Chennai. The Grand Anicut, Kalanai, on the Kaveri is older, traditionally credited to the early Chola ruler Karakala centuries before, but Chola-era inscriptions repeatedly mention repairs. Sluice builds new channels. The cultural achievement isn't a single dam. It's a water literacy trained into communities via sabas that had teeth. Land grants weren't just romantic farmland daydreams. They came with the expectation that new bunds got built, old sluices got cleared, and paddy economics stayed buoyant through monsoons and mischief. And then there were the cities that came and went, their streets like fossilized policy. Thanjavur and Kankayakonda weren't just capitals. They were development projects that synchronized artisans, priests, merchants, soldiers, and administrators into urban choreography. The Nagaram, the merchant quarter, gets ink in inscriptions. So does the Salia street of weavers, many of whom doubled as guild-affiliated militia. The Kaikols, who made cloth and, when needed, held spears. Their mix of industry and muscle appears constantly in royal charters. A temple wasn't just devotion. It was an employer with payrolls, spanning dancers, carpenters, bell metal workers, oil pressers, scribes, threshers, potters, and accountants. The big sanctum paid the small workshop. The scale of documentation is almost unbelievable until the numbers settle in. The Archaeological Survey of India's South Indian Inscriptions series runs to dozens of volumes. Tens of thousands of Chola period inscriptions dot Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Sri Lanka. They're boring, only until they aren't. A 10th century stone in a village near Kanchipuram names the oil seller who shorted the lamp fund. A 12th century slab in a Delta temple itemizes the food to be served to students. So many measures of rice, so many measures of curds. Copper plates from the 11th century set tax immunities for Buddhist monks in Nagapattinam. A dynasty that micromanaged the mundane, made culture impossible to miss. Odds are, someone wants the warriors. The Cholas give them elephants and drums. Raja I invaded Sri Lanka in 993. Rajendra I followed with deeper campaigns in 1017. Epigraphic records talk about the capture of the Sinhala regalia. The audience tends to zoom in there because military drama sells. But here's the twist. The cultural footprint outlasted the garrison footprint. Polonnaruwa, Sri Lanka's medieval capital, still holds Chola-style architecture in its ruins. Tamil inscriptions sit in Buddhist precincts. Chola coins, with the tiger emblem, have been found in Lankan hoards. For a culture-building dynasty, war opens trade routes that art keeps busy. The temples at the heart of all this weren't just stone metaphysics. They were multimedia devices. Picture a festival day at Chidambaram, the dancing Shiva's special stage, the Gopuram panels, some added later in the Chola period, display carved reliefs of the 108 Karanas. The transitional poses of classical Indian dance as passed in Bharata's Natya Shastra. The sculptures don't just decorate, they instruct. Dancers could literally point at carved stone as a cannon. Kulatunga, too, a 12th century Chola king, patronized major works at Chidambaram, and poetry casts him as an intimate of the Nataraja there. The temple as a dance manual, the stage as metaphysics, the king as donor, the dancer as pedagogy. Culture loops on itself. and fine structure. Divodasis. The women whose names marched across Thanjavure's granite complicate every tidy talk. The colonial and modern gaze likes moralizing. The Chola record is mostly operational. These women are salaried temple personnel, attached to specified mandapas and rituals. Their property rights get documented. Their absence on a festival day triggers fines. The term Tevaradiyar shows up. They are trained performers embedded in an economy that honors art as liturgy. Later abuses and exploitations are real and deserve their own history. But in the 11th century ledgers, these are professionals with administrative presence. The myth that reduces them to a caricature flattens a rich system that included discipline, status, and skill. Multiple religions threaded this space. The Cholas leaned Shaiva, yes, golden roofs at Chidambaram. Parantaka, high famously gilded parts of the shrine, became dynastic flex. But Vishnu's temples did not starve. Sarangam receives lavish endowments in the period. Even if many extant gopurams are later, the culture is permeable. Jain donors are recorded in Chola inscriptions. Buddhist monasteries get copperplate love via the Leiden plates. The bilingual nature of many charters, Tamil for local legalities, Sanskrit for pan-Indic prestige, says out loud what the architecture whispers. Pluralism as policy. The scripts themselves evolved. By the 10th century, the rounded Vatteluttu script was giving way to the modern Tamil script for Tamil texts, while Sanskrit portions were inscribed in Grantha. A bilingual world existed not only in speech, but in chisel. The visual culture of writing, curves, ligatures, letter forms, becomes part of the aesthetic environment. Every temple base is a museum label, and the labels are, frankly, better written than half the stuff online. Attention to materials made all this last. Granite took the reins. Bronze took the ritual. Lime plaster held the murals, and textiles, which almost never survive, left their ghosts in stone's folds and in ledgers listing payments to weavers and dyers. Temple sculptures show groupings of cloth that can be tied, draped, pleated. Inscriptions name Salia weavers as donors. Coins pay Kaikola guilds who make and guard cargo. The Chola court didn't just commission tunics. It built industry trusses around them. Tastes travelled. The tiger emblems on coins look charming now. But political language in metal mattered across shipping lanes. A Chola coin in Sri Lanka wasn't just small change. It was a calling card. Backed by fleets, the reach went north too. The Raja era copper plates announced themselves in Sanskrit titles. Sri Raja Deva, something that later pundits loved to interpret as cosmopolitan vibe and political marketing at once. This wasn't provincial swagger, it was platform building. If any dynasty earned bragging rights on water infrastructure, this one did. The Delta had always been coaxed into fertility, but the entanglement of tank, field and temple under the Cholas made that coaxing explicit. Temple trusts, Devadana lands, paid out in paddy to the dozens of job categories required to keep divinity on schedule. That meant reliable irrigation, or the ritual broke. The Sabah minutes, carved into stone, read like minutes of an engineering society. Who gets how much water? Which sluice opens when? Who maintains which tank bund? What happens if a breach floods a field? And because these are legal documents, names attached to duties, accountability wasn't theoretical. That emphasis on names leaks back into art. Look carefully at the base of certain bronzes and stone sculptures. Donor names sneak in. A signature here, a sculptor's mark there. Sembian Mahadevi's name shows up often, a patronage so sustained, it defines a bronze type in museum catalogues. Queens like Vanavan Mahadevi, Rajendra's mother, and Kundavai, Rajendra's sister, pop up in inscriptions as donors of lamps, processional images, and even whole shrines. In a world where the male royal charters usually hog headlines, women in the Chola court wrote permanence in metal. And then there's the academic cold shower. Many of the famous artistic standards that look timeless were shockingly specific. The agamas, ritual handbooks of temple construction and iconography, spelled out icon proportions to the finger joint. The stapatis, the master architects, did math before they did mantra. Squares within squares fixed the ground plan. The yoni and linga sockets had exact diameters. Pilaster counts per wall bay followed grammar. The Cholas didn't wing it. They templated genius. What about myth busting beyond the ramp story? The notion that Chola temples were big, mainly because some king had an ego problem, misses construction politics. Big stone sanctums in this era did not go bigger than Thanjavur because they didn't need to. Later temple building in South India focuses on gopurams, those towering gatehouses embossed with stucco deities, which explode under the Pandyas, Nayakas, and later rulers. The Cholas ground their aesthetics in the tower above the sanctum, the Vimana. If anyone wants to score internet points by comparing gopuram heights, they're talking about a different era. The Chola achievement was the original grammar. Later dynasties riffed on it. Another favorite straw man says that colonial admiration invented the Chola bronze as masterpiece. Meme. The compliments did get loud in the 19th and 20th centuries, yes. Auguste Rodin called the Nataraja the perfect image of divine dance. Museums fought over acquisitions, sometimes by loot rather than law. But the Chola record doesn't wait for Paris to clap. Temples shipped bronzes out for processions, dressed them, fed them, and fined staff if they were mishandled. That's valuation. When a community pours its annual surplus into an object and dances around it at midnight with lamps and music and poetics, the word for that is not ignorance. It's curating transcendence. The audience for all this wasn't narrow. The Oduvar's recitation schedules integrated the Tevaram into daily life. At sunrise, midday, and night, the specific hymns came on like prescribed playlists. Queens endowed the oil for these sessions and the rice for the singers' meals. Other specialists, the Talavarai women who swept, the Vilaku Apakarana who maintained lamps, the Tirupani artisans with lifetime appointments, pop up across inscriptions. Kids learned grammar at the Salai College. Adults bartered at the Nagaram. Merchants from across seas brought porcelain and took back pepper and textiles. The deity circled the town on a palanquin, while drummers pounded out cycles of 4, 5, 7, and 8 beats that sound modern only because nothing beats a good groove. Even their coin iconography reads like brand strategy. Tigers represent Cholas. Fish represent Pandyas. Bows represent Cheras. Put a tiger on copper, silver, and gold, and move it through delta markets and island entrepôts. Everyone who touches it gets the memo. It's like wearing a team jersey that doubles as currency. Hordes in South India and Sri Lanka make that brand story legible. Centuries later, writing in stone meant long-range usability. That's why this dynasty's cultural story reads like one long continuous comment thread. One inscription references another. A later king reopens a revenue stream blocked by an earlier clerical error and commits the fix to granite. The language of governance becomes the language of memory. When the Pandyas surge back in the 13th century, and later the Delhi Sultanate's incursions hit South India, Chola political power fades, but the cultural scaffolding they installed, the temple economy, the campus like Salais, The dance drama cycles, the bronze aesthetics, don't evaporate. They get adopted, adapted, and often exaggerated by successors. The cultural gene pool gets thicker. There's an aspect always underrated in coffee table discussions. Sound, inscription after inscription, names the Nagasvaram, the long pipe ensembles, the tavil drummers, the conch blowers. The schedule for playing them lines up with the lighting of lamps, with the waving of camphor, with the opening of doors. One Chola-era record enumerates which raga to sing at which temple gate. The resulting atmosphere, lowing of the conch, at dawn, the bronze bell tremors, the high clarion of the Nagasvaram at noon, the heavy human breath drum thunder at sunset, turns the temple into a timed soundstage. Culture isn't only seen, it's orchestrated. Some outtakes from the scholar's cupboard burn bright. The Dutch got the Leiden plates because 18th century colonial collecting had that energy. Epigraphists publish the plates now, and they feature line after line of Sanskrit and Tamil legalis, confirming that Rajaraja's Chola state made common cause with the Srivijayan Buddhist monastery. The text matters because it proves cosmopolitanism as policy, not accident. The Uttarama inscriptions, published in early volumes of Epigraphia, Indica, and Ashis, South Indian inscriptions, kill the idea that village self-government in India is some romantic 20th century reinvention. Those rules about age limits, qualifications, tax compliance, and rotations for office, they are 10th century bullet points. K.A. Nilakanta Sastri's The Cholas, first published in 1935, and still the go-to academic spine, stitches this whole web into a narrative with dates and documents, mapping what otherwise might look like random art into a dynasty's concerted program. UNESCO's Great Living Chola Temples listing doesn't gush. It reads, in officiales, about outstanding universal value. Translation, the world noticed. Under the hood, this wasn't just an Indian phenomenon. Across Eurasia, c. 1200, cultures behaved like this when they stabilized and enriched. The Song in China printing and urbanizing, the Fatimids in Cairo balancing power and patronage, the Capetians growing into Romanesque cathedrals in France. The Cholas belong in that top tier. The difference is geography. The Kaveri Delta's alluvial optimism birthed a kilometre-wide anthology of art and admin. That field-to-tank to temple wiring found ways to pull music, metal and math into the same daily cycle. Great stories want endings. This one dodges neat closures, because the cultural achievement of the Cholas isn't shaped like a statue on a plinth. It's shaped like a system. It took a peninsula's trades, a river's stubborn fertility, a handful of monarchs with taste and ambition, Vijayalaya starting things in the mid-9th century, Adityarai, Parantaka gilding Chidambaram, and drilling governance into granite, Uttamar as a bronze-style bearer, thanks to his mother Sembian Mahadevi, Rajaraja going maximal at Thanjavur, Rajendra refining and raiding across seas, Virarajendra entreatinizing kindness into a hospital, Kula Tunga smoothing East Chalukya Chola, merger politics into sustained patronage, and later Kula Tunga, Tuan Rajaraj, and Rajarasha, and it wired an art ecology that kept humming after the crowns shifted. Standing under the Thanjavur Tower, reading those carven payrolls, it's easy to assume this is all granite romance. Then, the Mathlands, 216 feet of drive, countless tons of reasoned mass, hundreds of named artists and staff, years of scheduled festivals, endowments measured in rice and coins, committees chosen by lottery in a pot, according to age and literacy rules, carved for anyone to see. The culture didn't fall from a royal aura. It climbed a ramp of routine. Ritual needed bronze. Bronze needed wax, clay, and craft lineages. Craft needed guilds. Guilds needed trade. Trade needed ships and ports. Ships needed lighthouses and harbors, which needed water management and town charters. Town charters needed law. Law needed inscription. Inscription needed aesthetics because permanence without beauty doesn't stick. So beauty wrapped law, and the law line pulled beauty out of time. That's the Chola dynasty's secret. It didn't worship art, it administered it. And administration, when done with taste, looks an awful lot like civilization on purpose. Now for the street-level texture that lingers after the epics and bronze glow cool down. A merchant guild charter from Baras in Sumatra mentions Tamil traders importing glass beads and exporting camphor. 1,000 years later, archaeologists find bead-making waste near Nagapattinam. Trade isn't a separate chapter. It's the footnote that keeps dropping back into the main text. Chola bronze casters, the Stapatis, and Kammors didn't just make deities. They also produced bells with harmonic partials, good enough to make a modern percussionist nod. The pay scale for bell ringers appears in at least one inscription. The economy of tone paid rent. Rajaraja's inscription in Thanjavur lists the daily quantities of key required to keep a specific number of lamps lit across the sanctum and halls. The number isn't poetic, it's operational. If a lamp goes out, the responsible trustee gets named and fined on cold stone. Divinity demands reliability. The tiger, fish, and bow icon triad on coins and seals ends up reproduced in modern textbooks, so often it looks like clip art. In context, it is the medieval Deccan and Tamil region's brand identity system. It told travelers at a glance whose warehouse they were dealing with. In Chinese records, the name Chulian or Julian wasn't a misspelling. It was a worldview. The Song Court looked across seas at a southern power with pepper and textiles and etiquette, and it wrote it down with the same clinical curiosity. Modern bureaucrats bring to trade data. Of course, there are fragilities. Srirangam got sacked in the 14th century when the Delhi Sultanate's armies pushed south. Some Chola bronzes went underground for safekeeping and never resurfaced. Colonial-era collectors plucked icons out of temples and village caches. Some of those pieces now sit in European museums, with only the name South India, 11th century, as consolation. It's not a happy footnote, but it does ironically confirm what the Cholas already knew. Art, that powerful, always moves. On the long ledger of cultural achievements, then, the Cholas chalk up architecture that perfected the southern Vimana grammar and seeded a millennium of temple town urbanism. Bronze artistry that turned theology into kinetic calm, using lost wax alchemy to cast individuals, not additions. Literature that curated the past, Tevaram, expanded it, Peryapuranam, and reimagined epics with local genius, Kamban, while keeping a parallel courtly stream of war poetry and urbane, all-verse alive. Governance, the recorded village elections, temple payrolls, school endowments, hospital staffing, and irrigation protocols with names, numbers, and penalties, in a form that shows respect for transparency without calling it that. Trade networks that put Tamil signatures on stone from Sumatra to Burma, swapped ceramics and cloth with the song, and embedded guilds into temple economies so deeply that material culture and ritual culture became codependent. A religious ecology that made room for Shaiva liturgy, Vaishnava devotion, Jain donations, Buddhist institutions, and bilingual charters, without having to shout tolerance into the void. A women's patronage tradition acknowledged on stone, bronze, and in temple names. with Sembian Mahadevi, Kundavai, and others banking cultural capital visibly. An aesthetic of inscription, not just the words, but the look of them, that turned architecture into a legal document and law into something citizens literally walked past daily. The myth factory will keep humming. A ramp will stretch longer in retellings. A king will acquire a swagger he may not have worn in life. A statue will be credited to an anonymous hand that probably had a name, a teacher, a cousin, and a house by the East Tank. Plenty of mysteries stay unsolved. How some of the heaviest components were positioned, how exact workshop lineages evolved, why certain icon types blew up in some decades and receded in others. But the Chola dynasty's cultural achievements don't require embellishment. The details already shock. Picture this other scene to close. A late monsoon evening in Darasaram. The Aravatesvara temple's stepped plinth glows red with the wet. Someone taps a stone riser on the steps. A pair of notes ring out like a toy xylophone hides inside granite. Two women cross the court, anklets whispering. An inscription on the wall behind them lists what the lamplighter earns and how many columns of paddy fund his work. A bronze siva waits in the mandapa for a procession that will send him into the streets, where a child will stare and remember the line of light and bell sound for decades. The administrative language on the stone ensures the oil shows up tomorrow. The icon ensures the culture shows up tomorrow. The dynasty fades. The system remains. The feeling remains longer. Call it genius. Or, more precisely, call it sustained competence in the service of the sublime. That's what the Cholas did better than almost anyone. They made culture routine. And by making it routine, they made it great. For our next story, we explore the leadership of Queen Victoria, a British icon. A 5-foot teenager walked into a room of sideburns, frock coats, and dynastic skepticism, and calmly rearranged the furniture. June 20th, 1837, Kensington Palace. The new monarch, 18-year-old Alexandrina Victoria, asked the Chancellor to place her chair where she could see everyone. Then she told her mother to wait outside. The heavyweights of the British state, men who had served George III, George Even, William Ive, stared at this calm, small figure and realized the old game had changed. Charles Greville, who lived to record every raised eyebrow in Westminster, wrote that her manner at that first Privy Council was composed, modest, and entirely businesslike. In short, a teenager walked in and started running the place. There was a myth that Victoria floated through history as a porcelain figurine in black silk. Reality snapped like a parade ground order. She had constitutional instincts that sharpened quickly, political will that could slam a door, and a sense of showmanship that built a monarchy brand strong enough to survive the 19th century's chaos machine. The early tests hit fast and messy. The court had been run by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and the mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy, who treated the young princess like a client. Victoria eliminated Conroy from her orbit in the first 24 hours of the reign. She moved bedrooms away from her mother. She made it clear that access ran through her, not through a parental gatekeeper. Anyone who has ever rearranged their phone settings on day one understood the vibe. But then came a scandal that showed the cost of rookie mistakes. The Lady Flora Hastings affair in 1839 blasted across the newspapers. Lady Flora, an attendant to the Duchess of Kent, developed an enlarged abdomen. Court whispers turned cruel. Victoria believed, wrongly, that Flora was pregnant by Conroy. A medical examination was ordered. It turned out to be a tumour. Lady Flora died on July 5th, 1839. The press tore into the Queen. She cried, she raged, and she learned. Being right felt good. Being fair mattered more. Historians like A. N. Wilson and Julia Baird point to this moment as a cold bath in public opinion for a very young ruler. Lesson absorbed. Then came the bedchamber crisis. Also 1839. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, Victoria's political tutor and comfort blanket, fell. Sir Robert Peel, Tory leader, tried to form a government. He requested changes to the Queen's ladies of the bedchamber because they were Whig-aligned. Victoria refused. Not just a bit of foot-dragging. Absolutely not. Peel backed out. Melbourne returned. The monarchy had just torpedoed a government over ladies-in-waiting. The whole thing is recorded in the correspondence of the time and dissected in Greville's diaries like a courtroom drama. It looked petty from the outside, but the stakes were massive. It was about whether the crown could remain a partisan fortress. In the very long run, she conceded the principle. Followers of Walter Bajart's The English Constitution will recognize the evolution. The sovereign has the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, the right to warn, not the right to veto the incoming Prime Minister over his feelings about the guest list at tea. In between ministerial crises, she fell hard for a German prince with serious cheekbones and a terrifying work ethic. She married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on February 10th, 1840. He was 20. She was 21. The dress was white. And yes, wedding dress law exploded. But the truth remains grounded. She did not invent the white wedding. White bridal gowns appeared in fashion plates and upper-class weddings for decades prior. What she did do was turn the look into a global brand. The Illustrated London News published engravings. Lacemakers in Honiton rejoiced. The wedding dress became a national industry and a Victorian manifesto. Spectacle meets sentiment. Source checkers nod here to Elizabeth Longford's work and to museum collections of textiles that still boast pieces from the day. Then came the sound. Nobody in a carriage wanted to hear. Bang. Bang. June 10th, 1840. The Mall, just months after her wedding. Edward Oxford fired 2 pistols at the Queen and Albert as they drove in an open carriage. Nobody was hit. Oxford was found insane and confined. Victoria responded like a constitutional thunderclap. She took more carriage rides. She made herself visible. She refused to hunker. An unspoken contract was in place. If the Crown demanded loyalty, the Crown had to display courage. Over the next 42 years, she faced a string of assaults and attempts, generally counted as 8 between 1840 and 1882, including shots by John Francis. Twice in 1842. An attempted attack by John William Bean, another attempt by William Hamilton in 1849, and a blow to the head from a cane wielded by Robert Pate in 1850. That last one left a bruise and a national gasp. The response was full-faced defiance. She went out in public again the next day. Parliament passed legislation in 1842 to stiffen penalties for assaults on the sovereign. The Crown's Pride team did not need a memo. The Queen and the nation would not be terrorized. The court, with Albert, gained focus. He was not a spare part. He was a project manager with a Prince Consort title, awarded officially in 1857 but spiritually earned long before. He reorganized the royal household, pruned expenses, and wrote memoranda on everything from army reform to sewer systems. Government ministers grumbled about Albert's non-stop notes. They also copied them. The Great Exhibition sprang from this partnership, like a glass and iron cathedral, to progress. Hyde Park, 1851. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, 6 million visitors in 5 months. a staggering number in a country of 27 million. The profits, roughly £186,000, seeded a cultural district in South Kensington that would grow into the V&A, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. Source nerds can read the exhibition's official catalogues and the parliamentary papers that track where the money went. The Queen beamed, Albert triumphed, and London learned that soft power could be engineered out of ticket stubs, skylights, and swagger. Foreign policy did not stay in ministers-only territory. She asserted her right to see dispatches, to comment, to demand changes. Her hardest sparring partner was Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, who adored freelance diplomacy. In 1851, he praised Louis Napoleon's coup in France without clearance. She and her ministers forced his resignation. The letters fly back and forth in the royal archives and in printed collections, all the bureaucratic heat of 1,000 emails before email. She was not conducting policy herself. She was enforcing the rules of constitutional engagement and shaping the tone at the top. Ministers answer to Parliament, but they also answer to the Crown's procedural rights. Then came the first industrial war to be photographed, telegraphed, and wildly mismanaged in the British press. The Crimean War, 1854 to 1856. Logistics broke, soldiers froze, sanitation failed. The charge of the Light Brigade became poetry and a sort of national migraine. Victoria followed the war minute by minute through dispatches and newspapers, wrote personal letters to the wounded and the bereaved, and pushed for reform. She visited hospitals with Florence Nightingale in the background, reinventing nursing. A medal emerged that said everything about what this monarchy wanted to reward. The Victoria Cross, created by royal warrant on January 29th, 1856. She personally overruled the original proposal that said for the brave, arguing that bravery could belong to many who never had a chance to win medals. The first investiture in Hyde Park on June 26, 1857, saw 62 recipients step forward. The medal has its own myth. The popular story says every VC is made from bronze of captured Russian guns from Sevastopol. Current scholarship, including metallurgical analysis, reported by the National Army Museum, complicates that romance. Early crosses likely came from gunmetal kept at Woolwich, some of it from Chinese origin, and the exact provenance of later batches shifted. The symbol held even when the origin story blurred. A monarch, defined by grief and restraint, minted a recognition for courage that was all grit, no glitter. India burned in 1857, the uprising that British sources long called the Mutiny tore through garrisons and cities, a convulsion of anger at colonial rule, with brutalities on both sides. The East India Company collapsed under the shock. The Crown took direct control with the Government of India, Act of 1858. Victoria played a specific and documentable role in the text that introduced the new regime. She pressed for language of religious tolerance and non-interference. Her letters to the draft's custodians, including Lord Derby and Lord Ellenborough, survive, and Miles Taylor has mapped the paper trail in Empress. The proclamation of 1858 promised equal treatment under the law, respect for customs, and the end of annexations. The empire did not suddenly become benevolent. It did acquire a moral tone from the top that politicians could quote back at administrators. She kept writing to Governor-General Lord Canning during the crisis, urging clemency even while the public mood raged for vengeance. The monarch's leadership was not about drafting budgets or ordering troop movements. It was about placing a boundary marker in words that would sit on every government wall in India for decades. The private catastrophe that followed knocked the breath out of everything. On December 14, 1861. Prince Albert died at Windsor, likely of typhoid fever. He was 42. She imploded. The image of the Black Queen did not come from nowhere. It came from years of heavy mourning, distortion of routine, resentment of public duties, and a fortress of grief built brick by brick. She withdrew to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and to Balmoral in Scotland. Ministers visited. Public ceremonies faded. The Punch cartoonists went feral. The Queen became, in the minds of many, an absentee landlord of the Constitution. Historians now temper the caricature. She still read dispatches, still wrote constantly, still influenced appointments, still held weekly audiences with prime ministers. But the visible, pageant side of monarchy shrank, and Republican murmurs grew. This was leadership by paperwork rather than by parade. It was not enough. Entered two men who played her politics like a piano, one thundering chords and the other whispering melodies. William Work, Gladstone. High-minded, reforming, intense. Lectured the Queen, as if the palace had paid for season tickets to his conscience. Benjamin Disraeli, sparkling, Tory, theatrical, practiced the dark art of flattery. Disraeli called her the fairy when writing to others, spun conversational gold at audiences, gave her India as a new title and meaning. Gladstone sent memos that felt like sermons. She recoiled. She wrote that Gladstone addressed her as though she were a public meeting. She adored Disraeli's style and forgave him more. This was not about policy purity. It was about emotional intelligence. Leaders respond to human style as much as ideological content. The record of letters in the Royal Archives bears out how he shaped her moods and how effectively he coaxed her back into public life. In 1876, Disraeli carried the Royal Titles Act through Parliament and made her Empress of India. The title did not change constitutional power in London. It did rebrand a monarchy for a global audience. A sovereign's self-presentation matters. It frames the story of state. The proclamation was read at Delhi on January 1st, 1877, and the image of Victoria as imperatrix lodged in the imperial imagination like a watermark. Her return to visibility deepened. The Golden Jubilee of 1887 exploded into pageantry. 50 years on the throne, processions, illuminations, hats, and an entire empire checking its own reflection. Photograph and engravings put that profile on mantelpieces in Bombay and Brisbane. 10 years later, the Diamond Jubilee dwarfed it. June 1897. 60 years on the throne, an unprecedented run in British history. Encircling the city came a procession of the Empire's representatives, sailors from the Royal Navy, colonials in uniforms that looked designed by a global haberdasher, and a queen who could barely move unaided but could still move crowds. Telegraphs crackled messages from Canada to Cape Town, to Calcutta. The British Empire under late Victoria was a red map and a communications network. The monarchy became the brand that held it together in peacetime. The soft power work snapped against hard moments. The Irish question roared all century long. She disliked Irish Home Rule intensely and never softened to it, frustrating Gladstone's attempts in 1886 and 1893. She worked ministers hard behind the scenes, pressing warning, leaning on the constitutional levers a British sovereign still possessed. Hansard records capture the debate. Her letters show the Crown's private pressure. She did not cross the red line into active political campaigning in public. She did maintain an unbending private position and used access as leverage. There was laughter at court, too. The unintentional comedy of a monarch trying to live in a goldfish bowl. She and Albert popularized the Christmas tree in Britain, especially after the Illustrated London News printed that 1848 engraving of the royal family around a decorated fir, a habit in certain German households, became a mass-market ritual that turned December into a glittering retail season. She adored dogs and paraded around Balmoral with a small army of them, including the famous Collie Noble and, earlier, the Skye Terrier Islay, who made it into multiple paintings. She collected personal mementos compulsively. She gave out autographs, like status tokens, to servants and locals in the Highlands. There was a grounded human behind the silhouette, and that groundedness was part of the leadership brand. The message reached across classes. A sovereign with a family, routines, pets, and preferences. Sometimes the human details detonated. After Albert's death, John Brown, a blunt-speaking Scottish attendant at Balmoral, became her closest confidant. He guarded, guided, and scolded with a familiarity that made courtiers tremble. The rumour mill renamed her Mrs. Brown. She commissioned a statue. She wrote affectionately of him. The archive of letters captured an intimacy of trust, if not of romance, and biographers have thrown elbows over where to draw the line. What remained undisputed was the fierceness of her loyalty and the public's appetite for soap opera. Brown's existence underscored a leadership trait modern managers recognize. She built circles of trust that did not always align with formal hierarchies, and she backed them through squalls of criticism. Then, in her late 60s and 70s, came another relationship that set off alarms in every drawing room from Windsor to Whitehall. Abdul Karim, the Munshi, arrived from India in 1887 for the Golden Jubilee as a servant and became her Urdu tutor and Indian secretary. He received rapid promotions, houses, rail passes, and the kind of attention that peeled paint off courtiers' dignity. Family members seethed. Ministers fumed. The Queen learned Urdu phrases, studied Indian culture, and tried to see beyond the stiff imperial gaze of her own court. After her death in 1901, Edward Vere swept through Karim's records like a monsoon and ejected him from his house. The documents that survived, and were later explored by writers like Shrabani Basu, reveal a sovereign attempting cross-cultural curiosity in an age of swagger. The political substance of the relationship was small. The symbolic splash was huge. The monarch tried to push her court to accept that Indians were not curiosities. The court pushed back. The conflict said plenty about the limits of the time and the stubbornness of prejudice. Her run-ins with threats never wholly ended. On March 2nd, 1882, at Windsor Station, a mentally ill man named Roderick MacLean fired at the Queen's carriage. He missed. A bunch of Eton schoolboys allegedly whacked him with umbrellas. The man was found insane and institutionalized. The Queen wanted the law changed to allow a verdict of guilty but insane, which Parliament introduced soon after. Ceremony requires safety. She maintained the balance with iron decorum and reforms when possible. Beyond the crown and sceptre, she wrote diaries, letters, notes to ministers, to family, to strangers who caught her attention. Tens of thousands of letters exist. She wrote to her eldest daughter, also named Victoria, with an intensity that must have strained the 19th century postal system, about childbirth, Prussian politics, and upholstery. The diaries survive in edited form because Princess Beatrice, obedient and thorough, transcribed them and destroyed volumes of the originals after her mother's death, a choice that broke historians' hearts and started arguments in archives forever. Even so, the material that remains is a torrent. Raw reactions to revolutions, notes on dresses, frustrations with prime ministers, grief, joy, petty judgments that read like a reality show confessional. 1 minute, and a geopolitical seminar the next. The public image that many carry in their heads, sour-faced, prudish, humorless, falls apart with a single tour through her letters. Sex was not a shame to her in marriage, and she wrote about the joy of it with Albert in terms that feel private and realistic. She loved music, dancing, the Highlands, and silly jokes. The line, "We are not amused," became the catchphrase of a century and probably never happened. The earliest source came decades after the fact, inconsistent and suspect. As Richard Aldous and other historians have pointed out, the real Victoria laughed plenty, sometimes at slapstick, sometimes at court gossip, and occasionally at herself. The myth of humorless sanctimony stuck because it made her a cartoon. The accurate picture is richer, more effective for leadership analysis, and funnier. The British Constitution, under Victoria, moved from backroom, aristocratic club to something closer to mass politics. The Second Reform Act of 1867 and the Third Reform Act of 1884 expanded the franchise massively. Between those two, the electorate roughly tripled. She did not craft those bills, and her support varied with the mood of her ministers, but she understood the direction of travel. She worried about radicalism. She used audiences to press caution. She also embraced the pageantry that democratic politics demands. A monarchy had to love crowds, even when the crowds did not love back. The monarchy's household turned itself into a brand laboratory. Photography helped. In 1860, the London photographer John Jabez Edwin Mayle sold carte visite photographs of the royal family by the tens of thousands. The Queen allowed it. The public bought them like sports cards. The domestic scenes, children in lace, dogs on rugs, comfort in high places, softened the image of monarchy at a time of steel, steam, and strikes. Victoria did not invent modern celebrity. She did refine royal relatability. She was not an early feminist and did not pretend to be. In an 1870 letter, she called women's rights campaigns a mad, wicked folly. She opposed women's suffrage publicly and privately. That stance sat beside a reign during which female education expanded. Women entered new professions, and suffrage campaigns grew. History enjoys this sort of paradox. A queen who disliked the women's movement presided over a civilization that empowered millions of women anyway, and a later queen would sign the Representation of the People Act without fuss. Leadership sometimes means resisting a current. You cannot stop. She chose resistance. The current moved on. Her family extended across Europe like ivy. 9 children, born between 1840 and 1857. 42 grandchildren. Marriages into the royal houses of Prussia, Russia, Denmark, Hesse, Battenberg, and Spain. The 20th century's royal family tree looked like a family reunion in which everyone shared last names and grudges. The gene for hemophilia slipped through her line, likely a new mutation in her case, and referred to for generations as the royal disease, shaping the fate of princes in Russia and Spain and altering politics in ways nobody at Osborne House could have predicted. Leadership brought unintended consequences in blood, as well as in policy. The Crown's ceremonial core saw change through her obsession with routine. She cultivated military ritual. She inspected troops. She handed out medals personally. She popularized the usage of Balmoral tartan and made the Scottish Highlands part of the monarchy's emotional landscape. Foreigners, reading punch cartoons and tourist brochures, assumed the Queen lived on a diet of oatcakes and stag hunting. She was a German-blooded British sovereign who turned Scotland into royal therapy and then into tourism marketing, long before Visit Scotland could file a logo. Zoom in on a single day that snapped her out of grief and back into national leadership. February 27th, 1854, she reviewed the guards before their departure to the Crimea. Soldiers described how she struggled with her voice and then found it. She distributed Crimean War medals later from Buckingham Palace and Hyde Park, pinned to uniforms by a queen who had made thousands of condolence notes her nightly work. The symbolism felt earned, not painted. Produce the records, and they show a monarch who did not stage manage from a distant salon. She risked being jostled, criticized, and bruised. Her signatures marched across Acts of Parliament and imperial dispatches. The Public Health Act of 1848, the Factory Acts, the abolition of the paper duty that made newspapers cheaper, the Education Act of 1870 that opened schooling to a broad swath of children, the Irish Land Acts that tried to unwind centuries of agrarian tension. Ministers drafted. She read. She commented in margins. The device of the constitutional monarch as nagging conscience and institutional memory functioned because she took it seriously. There was a comedic side effect to the monarchy's mania for ritual. State dinners could be blitzkriegs. She ate fast. Guests learned to sprint through courses because once the Queen finished, the plates vanished. Some poor ambassador would still be sawing at venison while the tablecloth shivered and the tureen retreated. Courtiers recorded the carnage in diaries. Leadership by tempo setting became a literal dinner table fact. She did not love the press. She used it anyway. The Times could laud or lacerate. Punch could mock or mythologize. She understood the spooky power of reproduction. Words and images bouncing by telegraph and steamship. So she yielded pictures, spread narratives, and fought back when caricature crossed into slander. When she returned to public life in the 1870s, with Disraeli's coaxing, she gave the newspapers what they needed. Visibility. The monarchy learned to feed the beast without being devoured by it. Internationally, her name rattled around diplomatic telegrams. She wrote to and about sovereigns, as if they were extended family, which in alarmingly many cases they were. Her eldest daughter married the Crown Prince of Prussia and became Empress Frederick for a short and troubled spell in 1888. Grandson Wilhelm II climbed the throne in Berlin with nerves of steel and hands all over the levers. She disapproved of his bluster. He adored her and ignored her. The family compact could not restrain the clang of geopolitical modernity. But her letters remind readers that beneath the headlines were actual relatives, awkward dinners, misplaced gifts, and queenly sighs. By the 1890s, the monarchy stabilized back into the daily life of a constitutional state. Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 turned London into a global stage. Church bells, street decorations, a fleet of ships painted in peacetime colours, colonial troops marching in the heart of the imperial capital. The morning service at St. Paul's, held outdoors because the Queen's mobility was limited, played like a benediction for an era that pretended to be secure. The colonial arch on the Strand looked spectacular and, to later eyes, ominous. The empire felt like a monument. Hidden in the foundations were fractures. She aged into a symbol beyond policy. The small figure in black, veil shading a face the whole planet recognized, became a timeline all by herself. Prime ministers rose and fell. Technologies appeared and reordered life. Railways, telegraphs, telephones, electric lights, motor cars. Through it all, that signature slanted across parchment. 11 British prime ministers served during her reign. Melbourne, Peel, Aberdeen, Palmerston, Derby, Russell, Disraeli, Gladstone, Salisbury, Rosebery, Salisbury, again. Foreign leaders lined up like a train schedule. Metternich fading out, Napoleon III, booming in and out, Bismarck fusing Germany together, Lincoln watching the Civil War tear the United States apart. The era carried her name, not because she micromanaged every piece of it, but because she symbolized the blend of tradition and acceleration that defined it. There were missteps, and they deserve oxygen. She shirked public duties to a degree in the 1860s that endangered the institution. She failed to grasp the depth of Irish grievance and whiffed chances to moderate policy with empathy. She backed her family to the point of tone deafness, protecting the reputation of sons and sons-in-law who did not deserve the velvet glove. She eschewed public leadership on social questions like women's rights that now look obvious. The ledger includes these items. The ledger also includes a constitutional monarchy that survived revolutions and reform. It includes the Great Exhibition's profit, underwriting a century of public museums. It includes a medal honoring ordinary soldiers' courage. It includes a proclamation to India that affirmed equality of rights, even in a regime built on inequality, and that gave reformers language to throw back at their rulers. It includes a modern monarchy's core doctrines: compel no government, criticize in private, perform in public. Myths thrive around her like ivy, and cutting them back turns out to be fun. She did not say, "We are not amused," as a mantra of life. She did not invent the white wedding, but turned it into copybook Victorian. The Victoria Cross's metal narrative suits a patriotic shiver more than a metallurgical report. The picture of an ice queen collapses under a pile of affectionate, exasperated, and sometimes saucy diary entries, and the claim that she wielded zero power ignores stacks of correspondence and testimonies from ministers who left Buckingham Palace, audiences feeling both supported and scolded. Two details offer tiny windows into how she treated leadership as craft rather than station. First, her handwriting. It was forceful to the point of illegibility, a slanted intensity that terrified private secretaries. She wrote fast, underlined aggressively, clarified with marginal arrows. That writing style showed a brain that thought in emphatic lines, not lazy loops. Second, the way she remembered names. She took mental notes on servants' families, officers' records, and ministers' tics. Audience notes and letters reveal a sovereign who used small bits of human information as glue in a very big system. Public health disasters and industrial poverty did not vanish under a queen's glare, but you can track her interest in sanitation from mid-century cholera scares to palace improvements. She listened to Edward Chadwick. She endorsed the work of Florence Nightingale and others who were not aristocrats. She toured slums with carefully planned glimpses, part concern and part theatre. The shortfall remains palpable. Victorians built empires and workhouses in the same breath. Her leadership could frame, bless, and sometimes fund, but it could not substitute for the hard grind of social reform legislation. Nevertheless, with each ribbon cut and message read, she gave reformers legitimacy. The presence of a monarch at hospitals and schools bridged class suspicion. The symbolism felt less like empty glitter and more like oil in the civic machine. When she finally died at Osborne House on January 22nd, 1901, at the age of 81, the news travelled by telegraph across the world she had put under one name. Her last days included moments that felt like a ledger check. She asked to be dressed in her wedding veil. She requested mementos of Albert and John Brown buried with her. She wanted the trappings of state and the tokens of private friendship alike. Court officials, generals, and family members surrounded the bed as if a century were leaning over a cradle. The funeral rolled like a new kind of pageant. She had left instructions against black horses and wanted white and purple instead, a flair for spectacle, even in mourning. Heads of state attended whose grandparents had shared her table and whose grandsons would soon share battlefields. The Edwardian era began before the last gun salute echoed. An age named after a woman who had once been a teenager, rearranging a chair closed with men, rearranging a world she had symbolized but could no longer influence. The verdict on leadership needs to pull together the threads. She began as a young ruler, entangled in her mother's court and the petty wars of Victorian patronage. She matured into a constitutional sovereign who wrote, read, and argued her way into ministers' respect. She turned the monarchy into a family brand built on visibility, domesticity, and a sense of duty. She fused mourning and majesty into a public identity that endured low approval and roared back through spectacle. She allowed more than one prejudice to steer her and missed chances for empathy, but she also pushed her empire to at least say the right things about tolerance. She believed in bravery enough to invent its medal and in propriety enough to chop off a cabinet minister's freelancing. She coaxed, warned, encouraged, and occasionally intimidated. She chose the hard path of institutional patience over the easy thrills of autocracy. The British monarchy that walked into the 20th century did so on her legs, still short, still determined, and still moving at a surprising clip. Source junkies can track the scaffolding. Greville's Memoirs for the First Days in 1837, the Queen's Journals in the Royal Archives, edited by Princess Beatrice with all the controversy that implies, Hansard for debates on reform, India, and Irish legislation, the Victoria Cross Royal Warrants, and the National Army Museum's notes on the medal's metal, the official catalogues and parliamentary reports of the Great Exhibition, Elizabeth Lomford's biography for the marriage and early reign, Lytton Strachey's Tard, tape for the period's myths and revisionist jolts, tempered by A. Wilson and Julia Baird for balance, Miles Taylor's Empress for the India Nexus, Shrabani Basu's work for the Munchie, the Illustrated London News for images that taught a nation to decorate a tree and recognize a silhouette. A small woman with a large pen shaped a system designed to outlast any one person. The trick lay in understanding which levers to pull, when to let a minister own his own mess, and how to turn personal tragedy into national ritual. She did not govern. She led. The difference is everything. Underneath the tiara and the black crepe stood a leader who never stopped insisting on her right to read the draft, to write in the margin, and to show up, bullet bruise on her forehead. Cheers or jeers in the air, determined to keep moving forward. Let's dive into our next piece. The rise and fall of the Hittite Empire, Iron Age power. An empire storms out of the Anatolian highlands, sacks Babylon in one clean strike, stares down Pharaoh at a place called Kadesh, signs the world's earliest known international peace treaty, gets blamed for inventing the Iron Age, and then disappears so completely that the world forgets its name for 3,000 years. The Hittite Empire never asked for subtlety. It asked for roads, horses, and enough bureaucrats to turn a mountain fortress into a continental traffic control tower. Visualize central Turkey around 1650 Botch. Dry steppe, oak scrub, cold winters that punish dreamers. On a rocky ridge inside a bend of the Budakazu stream sits Hattus, a city bristling with cyclopean walls and gate lions that look like they've done serious overtime. The locals call this place the land of Hatti. And that name sticks long enough that later scribes will call the whole region Hattiland, even though the language of power in the royal palace is Indo-European Hittite. The Hittites call their tongue Nesite, after Kanesh/Nesha, the trade town where Assyrian merchants kept shop in the 19th-18th centuries. B. writing thousands of tablets about donkey caravans, copper shipments, taxes, and who owes whom a pot of tin. That older Assyrian archive lays out the highway map. The ridges of Anatolia are lousy with bandits, but the trade runs anyway because bronze societies need tin, like modern societies need microchips. He walks in with a name that gets reused like a Dynasty brand. Labana, but he will style himself Hattussi the Eye, man of Hattusa, around 1650 bars. He turns a tough little hill town into a central command. In his own annals, the highways blaze outward, north against the Kaska tribes in the Pontic Mountains, southeast toward Aleppo and the old Hurrian city-states, west into Luwian-speaking lands where each valley keeps its own petty crown. By the time his heir Musili takes the throne, the Hittite playbook is set. Ride fast, hit the city that thinks it is safe, cut a treaty if the walls hold, move on if they do not. In 1595 Beth, give or take a few years depending on which chronology is preferred by the moderns, Musili barrels a Hittite army, more than 1,200 kilometers down the Euphrates, and sacks Babylon. Hammurabi's dynasty buckles. The Hittites do not stay. They do not need to. They grab loot, shake the map, and head home before the logistics turn ugly. That raid breaks the prestige of the old Babylonian kings and opens the door for the Kassites. It also sets a pattern for the Hittites. Dazzling strikes followed by exhausting palace drama. Instability chews the dynasty. Musili gets assassinated by his brother-in-law Hantilii, and the palace sees a line of short-lived kings with names that read like a gossip column of coups. Zidanta Hammana, and a slate of princes with grudges. The Edict of Telepinu, around 1525 Bes, becomes the Hittite answer to too many uncles with knives. Telepinu puts down reform in clay, establish primogeniture, stop murdering your way into the throne room, and keep the royal house from collapsing every decade. He even prescribes how succession should work when the obvious heirs are minors, because he has seen what happens when every general thinks he is destiny. The edict also locks in Hittite political style. Royal oaths, loyalty treaties, and curses with creative bite. One loyalty oath, text promises a god's wrath on the disloyal down to the fingernails and livestock. Corporate hair wishes it had that kind of bite. After Telepinu, Hatti slumps. Cascaraders pound down from the north, and the Hurrian Mitanni build a chariot empire across northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Hittite kings hold Hattusa with their teeth and push back where they can. They inherit a mess of enemies and a ridiculous advantage. A state engine customized for long-distance management in a world where most kings barely patrol the next hill. Hattusa itself looks like the ultimate Bronze Age layered cake. Stone terraces step up the slope. Gates blink with animal guardians. The Lion Gate growling dignity. The King's Gate with a warrior carved in high relief. The Sphinx Gate near a satellite town called Alakahuyuk. The Great Temple, Temple 1, sits fat and serious at the heart, with 80-plus storerooms lining its courtyards. The storerooms are not aesthetic. They are logistics. Grain, oil, ritual gear, and tablets get shelved there like a Bronze Age Costco. Roads and causeways connect the whole thing because the Hittite army moves on barley, and barley needs storage. By the 14th century Bas, dynastic paralysis ends, and Hittite ambition calls itself Superluliuma I. The name rolls for 2 decades of offense, roughly 1344, 1322 Ba, in middle chronology terms, and every major neighbor gets a memo in the form of chariot dust. He reconquers central Anatolia, drags the Kaska back into the forests, and then takes on the Mitanni, the Hurrian-speaking chariot lords, who have been strong for a century along the Habur and Upper Euphrates. Suppiluliuma does not just beat them. He breaks their political engine. He installs Shatiwaza, a Mitannian prince, as a puppet in a treaty that survives in Hittite files. A document modern scholars like Gary Beckman and Trevor Bryce point to when explaining how Hittite diplomacy works. There is a reason the archives at Hattusa eventually yield more than 30,000 tablets and fragments. Every conquest spawns oath, marriage contracts, boundary agreements, and courier rosters. Syria, the Mediterranean hinge, with ports like Ugarit and Byblos, becomes the great game board. Amaru changes sides like a weather vane. Karchemish and Aleppo go from targets to viceroy seats, staffed by the king's sons. One son, often called Piasili, takes the Hurrian throne name Sari Kusu because Hittite elites understand branding in multiple languages. South along the coastal roads, vassal treaties lock in. Kings keep their thrones if they love the Hittite king, pay tribute, deliver troops, and stop flirting with Egypt. Infractions get remedied with military visits. Then comes the letter that every retelling of late Bronze Age drama loves. In the years after Tutankhamun's death, a letter arrives to Suppilulium from an Egyptian queen, memorialized in Hittite archives by the scribal tag Dakamunzu, Hittite for the king's wife. She declares her husband dead and her throne empty of heirs. She requests a Hittite prince to marry and secure the Egyptian crown. Suppiluliuma hesitates, sends envoys, then sends a son, usually identified as Zananza, toward the Nile. The prince dies en route, apparently murdered near the frontier. The Hittite response is cold rage. Armies take towns on Egypt's northern flank in Syria. Then comes a different twist of fate. Plague rips through Hatti, a long episode recorded in the Plague Prayers of Mursili II. A younger son, who takes the throne after Anuwanda II dies quickly of the same sickness that killed their father. Those prayers read like someone who understands logistics, trying to understand theology. Which god is angry? Which ritual can persuade a halt? And how many years can an army hold lineup drills while the royal family buries kings? Mursili II rules roughly 1321, 1295 Betch, and uses the time to stabilize. He reconquers Arzawa in the west, keeps the Casca mostly in their lanes, and cements control over vassals across Syria. His annals are the reason modern historians can narrate his campaigns year by year. His scribes count days of marching and name the rivers. The tone is unglamorous and effective, a reminder that the Hittite Empire is a triumph of notebooks as much as chariots. Then comes Muwatalli II, roughly 1295-1272 Bess, who stares at the map and moves the capital from Hattusa south to Tarhunt Sufa. On paper, it looks reckless. In context, it reads as strategic. Tarhuntassa puts the king closer to the Syrian theatre and farther from the eternal Casca headache in the north. He appoints his brother, Hattusili, as the northern fixer, a prince with grit, who reconquers the sacred city of Nerik from the Casca, runs the frontier around Hakis, and builds the kind of local legitimacy that makes succession complicated later. Egypt under Ramses II and Hatti under Muwatalli II collide at Kadesh around 1274 BC. The battle description sprawls across Egyptian stone in grand scale at Luxor, Karnak, the Ramesseum, and Abu Simbel. The Hittite side is not preserved in murals, but lives in a terse letter trail and later Hittite memory. The Egyptian texts brag in pharaonic fashion, and both sides celebrate victory after a draw that could have gone either way. Numbers remain debated. Egyptian sources inflate for effect, Modern analysts, including Kenneth Kitchen and Trevor Bryce, often put Egyptian infantry around 16,000, 20,000, with 2,000 chariots. Hittite forces may have fielded a similar infantry total, with perhaps 3,000, 3,500 heavier, three-man chariots, joined by a Confederate lineup of vassal troops from Aleppo, Carchemish, and Amoru. The Hittite chariot hits like a Bronze Age punch. 3 men per cart, 1 driver, 1 shield, 1 lancer. The Egyptian chariot runs lighter and faster with 2 men. The battle swings across the Orontes in heat and dust, with Hittite chariots crashing the Egyptian Ra division as it straggles in Egyptian counterattacks, clawing back after Ramesses' personal guard stabilizes the panic. After the screaming, Kadesh stays under Hittite sway. Egypt keeps its border and its pride. The scoreboard reads as a stalemate that cements 2 superpowers instead of breaking one. Mu'tali dies. His son Teshub, throne name Mursili III, takes over from Tauhontasa. Hattusili, the fixer brother, sees his influence in his promised lands in danger. Politics break the family dinner. Hattusili wins a civil war, declares himself Hattusili III around 1272 Bas, and writes a long, self-justifying text modern scholars label the Apology of Hattusili. The document should be required reading in every seminar on political spin. It blames a wicked nephew, lists faithful service, cites oracles, invokes gods, and ends with the gentle suggestion that the gods chose Hattusili. The deposed Mursili III flees to Egypt. International awkwardness follows. Instead of another Kadesh, the world gets a different first. A treaty, the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, duplicated on Egyptian temple walls and found in Hittite cuneiform at Hattusa, arrives in 1259 B, year 21 of Ramesses' text. It codes non-aggression, mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, and a promise to stop sheltering each other's runaways. The Egyptian version calls Ramesses the Big Brother. The Hittite version prefers parity. The modern reader can choose which flourish to believe, while noticing that the text clauses line up almost word for word. Kudeb, Hattusili's formidable queen, co-seals the dealings and starts a long diplomatic pen-pal relationship with Ramesses II and his officials. Her letters show an executive mind and a taste for order. She also engages in a religious rationalization project inside Hatti, aligning deities, standardizing cults, and writing like a CFO who takes myth seriously. In some letters, she requests Egyptian physicians for the Hittite court. In others, she negotiates marriages. Her seal keeps showing up, large and confident. The superpower detente even becomes family drama light, with Ramesses marrying a Hittite princess a decade later. In the 13th century Bas, Hatti looks like the Bronze Age state that actually read its own memos. The empire delegates power to royal sons as viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo. Treaties multiply in a tight web, complete with border stones and curses. The field army musters seasons ahead. Roads across central Anatolia get regular maintenance, because missing a marching season ruins careers. Hittite scribes compile land grant documents in which the king rewards soldiers and officials with plots that carry military obligations. It is feudal in feel but rational in its accountancy. The law code, compiled and updated over centuries, favors fines over death penalties for many crimes and scatters the state's peculiarities across clauses that make modern readers pause. Banishment for certain forbidden livestock relations, heavy penalties for others, compensation tables for bodily harm, and a surprisingly practical view of property damage. Weapons and tech tell another truth that undercuts a popular myth. The Hittites did not drag the world into the Iron Age. Iron in their time reads as rare, prestige, and sometimes meteoritic. The Hittite word for iron, often written with the Sumerogramman, bar, appears in text, and iron objects exist in the archaeology of Hatti, pins, daggers, and ceremonial gear, but they are rare and elite. The bulk of Hittite warfare runs on bronze, copper plus tin, plus arsenic on the margins. The iron dagger in Tutankhamun's tomb, for example, is meteoritic iron, not smelted. Real iron smelting there becomes routine, does not roll into the Eastern Mediterranean until after 1200 B, and generally not at scale until the 10th-9th centuries. The old yarn that the Hittites invented ironworking and guarded it like a state secret falls apart under metallurgical assays and the sheer absence of industrial iron debris from 14th freight. 13th century Hattusa. Modern scholarship, including Billie Jean Collins and Trevor Bryce, stamps that myth flatter than a hammered ingot. The Hittites were a late Bronze Age superpower, not the inventors of a new age. What they did master was management. Hattusa's archives include not just royal annals, but also letters to Zilia, the governor, about taxes, oracle reports run by ritual specialists, and international missives to vassals who are getting ideas above their treaty station. The scribes write in cuneiform Hittite, in Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, and for public monuments in Luwian hieroglyphs. That last script packs ancestral swagger. It looks like an Anatolian cousin of Egyptian hieroglyphs and gets carved on monumental stones across the empire, and later, across the so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms. When the capital needed pageantry, the Hittites went to Yazilakaya, a rock sanctuary just outside Hattusa. In long relief processions cut into the rock, most likely in the reign of Tudaliya Eve, thunder gods and sun goddesses stride toward each other, with protective deities and underworld gods marching in sets. Depending on which scholar one reads, Poyatra Taracha on religion. For example, the Pantheon at Yazilakaya compresses a theology that sprawled across 1,000 city cults. The Hittites themselves used to say they ruled the land of 1,000 gods. Not because they were sloppy, but because they strategically refused to delete anyone's hometown deity. Conquest did not erase. It collected. The storm god of Hatti, called Tahuna or Tarhunt, sits next to the Hurrian Teshub. The sun goddess of Arina links with the Hurrian Hepat. Shaushka, essentially an Ishtar type, walks with a personal retinue. A managerial mind could love this religion. Why anger locals by saying their god is wrong when one can say their god is now friends with the royal god, and both enjoy bigger festivals? The empire's west holds its own dramas. Arzawa, the big confederation in western Anatolia, gets taken down by Mursili II. The Hittites map western cities like Mira, Seher, Riverland, and Wilusa into their treaty world. Wilusa lights up modern imaginations because philologists connect it to Ilion/Troy. There is a treaty with Alexander of Wilusa, a name suspiciously close to Alexander/Paris, centuries before Homer. Another letter, the Tawagalawa letter, records Hattusili III, addressing a great king of Ahiawa, likely the Mycenaean Achaean world, about a freebooter named Piamaradu and the way coastal politics have gotten messy. This is not the Trojan War, with wooden horses and Achilles in perfect bronze. It is more like a spreadsheet of grudges, sea lords, and coastal raids. It is thrilling anyway because it proves the Hittites knew the Aegean players not as vague sea peoples, but as named kings with embassies and egos. To the east and southeast, Assyria grows teeth again. In the late 13th century, kings like Tukulti-Ninurta I push the kingdom's border west. The Hittites and Assyrians collide in the mountains northwest of the Tigris, tugging at the Hurrian buffer states. The exact battle outcomes are debated, but the sense is clear. The late empire fights with one hand on Syria, one hand fending off Assyria, and both eyes watching the Casca, Tutalia Eve, who reigns roughly 1217. B. Inherits the détente with Egypt and the enduring anxiety about the southern capital, Tarhuntasa. He embarks on an infrastructure binge. Inscriptions point to dams and reservoirs in the Hattusa hinterland, and restorations in recent decades have even brought some Hittite dams back to life. Tudhaliya's court elevates Yizalikiah to its grandest form. He also signs a notorious treaty with a relative, Kurunta of Tarhuntasa, carved on a bronze tablet found at Hattusa in 1986. The treaty recognizes Kurunta's autonomy in Tarhuntasa under Hittite suzerainty and entangles the royal house in a thicket of clauses that probably made sense across the council table and sounded more ominous the moment a drought hit. Meanwhile, Hittite envoys remind Ugarit to keep paying taxes and supplying ships. Vassal states grumble. The palace leans harder on ritual and oracles, a sign not of superstition but of stress. When everything depends on which king got what sign on which day, the bench of diviners does not sleep much, and then the floor gives way in the early 12th century baths. The old label sea peoples gets thrown around until it means everything and nothing. Better to start with the evidence. Ugarit burns around 1190-1185 BES. Letters from its last king beg for help and announce enemy ships at the coast, while the local army is away. A Hittite king, almost certainly Suppiluliuma II, campaigns against Elashia, Cyprus, and claims a naval victory. His inscription reads, "Like a man trying to keep every hole in a dam plugged." A sea fight here, a punishment raid there. Inland, the Hittite heartland seizes. Tree ring and isotope studies from junipers in central Anatolia point to a brutally severe, multi-year drought centered near 1198-1196 Bash. Pollen cores from the eastern Mediterranean show aridification trends around the same horizon. Scholars such as Sturt Manning and colleagues in scientific journals, and earth scientists like D. Kanievsky's team in Panis join historians in reading a climate signal strong enough to break food security. When a state runs on barley rations and caravan taxes, 3 years of harvest failure and runaway banditry flip stability into collapse. At Hattusa, the final burn layer tells a story that is louder than anyone's annals. The citadel and lower city get torched around the same decades. The palace is emptied before the fire eats it, which indicates evacuation more than surprise annihilation. The Casca, always the northern threat, likely play a role in the endgame. Internal civil conflict probably joins the fire, with factions tied to Tarhuntasa, Karchemish, and the royal family charging different ways. Suppiluliuma II leaves inscriptions about war, but no tablets about reforms. One palace text from the end complains about a famine so bad that the palace sells bronze tools and palace assets to buy grain from Ugarit just before Ugarit itself dies. It reads as a scramble. The capital stops functioning. The archivists do not file the last letters because the couriers stop coming. The Hittite powerhouse shatters, but it does not vanish. It migrates and fragments. The sons and viceroys in the southern arc of the empire keep going in a new political ecology. Historians label them the Neo-Hittite or Luwian Aramaean kingdoms, and their names populate Assyrian annals for centuries. Karchemish, Melid, Malatya, Kuma, Girgam, Tabal, K, Cilicia, Patina, Samel. They carve texts in hieroglyphic Luwian on stelas and walls. One famous bilingual monument at Karatate in Cilicia, 8th century Bas, pairs Phoenician and Nubian, a Rosetta for later scholars like J. David Hawkins to crack the script systematically. These polities blend Hittite traditions with new Aramaean neighbors, becoming the cultural bedrock for much of Iron Age Syria and southern Anatolia until Neo-Assyrian kings such as Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, Tiglath-Pile, and Sargon II crush or absorb them. In the 9th-8th centuries, Bes, back in the Anatolian highlands, the silence after 1200 Bes is unnerving. No more clay files at Hattusa, no more chariot rosters. Local communities survive, sometimes in the shell of old cities, but without the royal machine that made the place hum. Centuries pass. Greek epic sings of a Trojan war without naming Hatti. Biblical texts mention Hittites, but those are local Anatolian or Levantine groups, not the great kings of Hattusa. The empire that ran on laws and logistics gets overwritten by newer powers and legends. The memory gap spans 3 millennia. Rediscovery reads like a 19th, 20th century detective thriller, except the detective carries a trowel. In 1834, the French explorer Charles Texier stumbles across the massive ruins at Boğaz Köyü in central Turkey. He sees walls and carved lions and knows it is ancient, but cannot name it. In 1880s, 1890s, scholars decode hints from inscriptions written in a weird script that looks like cuneiform, but reads unlike anything known. The big break arrives in 1906, when Hugo Winkler, a German archaeologist, and Theodore Macready Bey of the Ottoman Imperial Museum begin major digs at Boğaz Köyü Hattusa and pull thousands of tablets out of the royal archives. The archive looks like a Bronze Age hard drive and includes treaties with Egyptian pharaohs, letters to vassals in Syria, and myths about gods and serpents. Then comes 1915, and Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech Assyriologist, who proves that the unknown language on many tablets belongs to the Indo-European family. He shows this with unglamorous, brilliant philology. Words for bread and water that behave like their cousins in languages as far away as Sanskrit and English. One teaching sentence from those texts becomes famous among linguists because it reads so comfortingly banal. Now bread is eaten, now water is drunk. Indo-European grammar in clay. The new old empire starts getting biographies. Garstang, Goetz, Gurney, Güterbok, and in later decades, scholars like Trevor Bryce, Gary Beckman, Billie Jean Collins, J. David Hawkins, and Mark Whedon unpack the state one tablet at a time. Archaeologists restore city walls, excavate the great temple storerooms, map the royal citadel Büyükçekmece, and clean the reliefs at Yazilikaya so the weathered gods look like they are still ready to campaign. The Hittite archives become one of the 3 great late Bronze Age libraries on Earth, alongside the palace texts at Ugarit and the Amarna letters from Egypt. Together, they sketch the backrooms of a world that, for centuries, only had surviving monuments to boast for it. What emerges is an empire both alien and weirdly familiar. The Hittite court insists that every subordinate swear loyalty with their own voice, touches treaties with ritual oil, and then sends tax collectors to check the grain. Vassal kings keep their crowns, but only under a mesh of obligations that makes modern compliance officers nod in recognition. When an earthquake hits, the Manapata famously blames a storm for wiping out grain in western Anatolia. The bureaucracy notes it and assigns responsibility. When a royal favorite tries to grab too much, The Apology of Hattusili tries to bury him under narrative and judicial language. The Hittite laws are tough, but often pragmatic. Most assault injuries come with a compensation list. Only certain crimes get death. Slaves are not just property. Sometimes they can marry and get free. And in some cases, a slave's status depends on specific debt structures. Fascinatingly, blunt lines about sexual crimes and taboos tell modern readers the Bronze Age elites did not share later moral panics in the same units. The army remains the empire's public face. It looks less romantic than later cavalry fantasies, and more like a moving city with wheels. Chariots are the prestige arm. Horses come from steppe-facing Anatolian lands, trained with manuals the Hittites preserve in detail, including one-horse training text associated with a man named Kikuli of Mitanni that lays out conditioning regimes in multi-day cycles. The core, infantry, probably consists of levies from provincial lands, with shield and spear, plus specialized units from vassals, light troops, archers, and slingers. Bronze helmets with cheek guards and scale armor coats show up in iconography and archaeology. Light shields, likely made from wood and leather, protect the charioteers' partners. Supply lines matter more than swagger. The Hittites bake bread and grind grain on campaign. They schedule marches to avoid harvest times because missing a barley crop means losing both soldiers and taxes. The state even builds depots forward in Syria. Those warehouses are the reason armies can loiter at Kadesh long enough to stage dramatic ambushes and counter-punches. Culture at court mixes Syrian-Babylonian glamour with Anatolian grit. The Hittite scribes love Akkadian for diplomacy, and Hittite for internal memos. Monumental art rarely matches Egyptian polish, but it snarls with attitude. The Lion Gate lions at Hattusa give off the aesthetic of a society that wants to humiliate raiders when they arrive. The Sphinx Gate at Alaka-Huyuk flanks a processional road with stone for aesthetics and message. Rock reliefs dot the empire's edges, like the kingly relief at Karabal near Izmir, with a Luwian inscription that drew travelers' attention, since at least Herodotus, who misguessed it as an Egyptian carving. Luwian hieroglyphs run across many of these reliefs, and in the Iron Age they become a primary vehicle for local histories and royal boasts. Religion hums behind and through everything. A spring festival called Peruli celebrates the storm god defeating a serpent named Ilyanka. Another famous myth tells of the fertility god Telepinu getting angry and vanishing, causing crops to fail, livestock to miscarry, and humans to starve until a tiny bee finds him, stings him awake, and escort rituals bring him back. The empire takes ritual technology seriously. Scapegoat rituals move sin into animals or objects and send them out. Old women ritual experts, real job title, not an insult. Run apotropism that moderns would call psychological first aid during crisis. Oracles get consulted with a level of bureaucratic care that turns divination into a paper trail. If a king needs to confirm whether to move the capital or march to Syria, he consults the god of the night, the goddess of the sun, and cross-checks. The empire's foreign policy showcases late Bronze Age realpolitik with actual receipts. The Egyptian-Hittite treaty sits on the wall at Karnak and Ramesseum and in a tablet room at Hattusa. Good luck finding an earlier bilateral treaty with mutual extradition clauses. Hittite treaties with vassals like Amiru outline what exactly counts as treason, how many chariots a local king owes, how often he must pay gift that is really tax, and where exactly the border stones sit. A land grant, text to a man named Uratar Hunter, has the tone of a modern deed with terms and conditions apply, spelled out by gods. The bronze tablet between Tudalia Evi and Karunta reads like a family lawyer wrote it during a tense dinner. The Hittites built foreign policy like it was urban planning. Then, with brutal speed, the structural supports fail. A crisis stack hits. Drought, famine, internal splits, Casca pressure, rebel vassals, and a Mediterranean in riot. The so-called Sea Peoples raid coasts from Anatolia to the Nile during the decades around 1200 BY. The exact origins of those groups vary. Some likely from the Aegean, some from western Anatolia, others from the central Mediterranean. Ramesses III's reliefs at Medinet Habu depict sea battles with feather-helmeted warriors and boat rams. Hittite inscriptions are sparser, but tell of Alashia campaigns and burned scars. Ugarit's last letters put an expiration mark on the whole coastal network, everything that made the Hittite Empire effective. The centralization, the treaty web, the taxed sea lanes, becomes a liability when the network fails. The state needed caravans to feed the army. The caravans stop. The state needed vassals to guard frontiers. Vassals fend for themselves. The state needed rain. Anatolia coughs dust. The capital empties. Hattusa burns. Archaeologists find broken bits of terracotta bull horns and religious paraphernalia in the ash. They also find storerooms with jars smashed in collapse, as if someone had yanked the shelves. The palace on Büyükali shows signs of hurried evacuation. Up the mountain, Uzalakaya waits in the sun, its gods carved into limestone, watching dust swirl where royal processions once moved. The states of the south keep the old titles. The great king becomes the king of Karchemish. It is a demotion in geography more than in ritual pride. For 2 more centuries, Assyrian annals list Western warlords as kings of Hatti even when those kings rule only 1 valley deep. Modern viewers love a single cause. History refuses. This collapse in Hatti is a perfect storm. Climate research points to real drought, years. Textual evidence points to fiscal strain and famine. Archaeology points to burning by hostile forces. Letters point to internal betrayal. Long-term trends show Assyria rising as Hatti weakens. That mix beats any one factor in drama and mess. The postscript runs through 19th, 20th century scholars who turn the forgotten empire into a well-sourced saga. The decipherment of Hittite as Indo-European shakes up language history. For a while, some purists argue that Hittite's Indo-European status looks odd because it lacks some classic features. Then the term, an Indo-European language, with archaic features, settles the argument. That phrase hides a marvel. Hittite preserves forms that other Indo-European languages later lose, which means it helps reconstruct the family's early branching. The language angle is not just academic. It proves that Indo-European speech had made it into Anatolia by the early 2nd millennium BES, blended with, but not erasing, the older Hattic and Luwian tongues. The state's name in the Bible, Hittites, turns out to be more regional than imperial. The great kings of Hatti probably never knew those later authors' references. Scholars like Mark Whedon have fun explaining the layers, while David Hawkins slices through the Luwian hieroglyphic tradition with slow, relentless, brilliant epigraphy. Museums fill with Hittite lions and bull-headed gods. The great temple storerooms offer bits of daily life. Ceilings, potsherds, beads, oil jugs. At Alakahuyuk, relief show processions of priests and bulls and men with curling hair. The Hittite rock relief at Karabel gets identified as a Luwian inscription by a Hittite-descended king, not Egyptian at all, and the long game of misidentification stops. Tourists at Boaz Kui walk under the Lion Gate, feeling a prickle at the back of the neck that says power lived there. Hattusa's walls, rebuilt in sections, show the scale. Gates with glacis mounds demonstrate defensive engineering that would humiliate untrained raiders. The lower city's great temple proves the priests had serious storage problems and deep solutions, and that logistics is a religion's best friend. The stone channels and dam sites suggest Tudalia's hydraulic ambitions were not a fantasy. Even the humor writes itself. The empire that never invented the Iron Age gets saddled with it for a century of textbook oversimplification. And then metallurgists run laboratory tests that show the Bronze Age hang tag belongs back on Hatti. A kingdom famous for warfare becomes equally famous for a peace treaty because it turned propaganda stalemate into legal structure. A state that said it had 1,000 gods turns out to be streamlined genius in religious politics. Never delete, always annex. A world that forgot the Hittites learns their names again because of grueling, unglamorous archaeological fieldwork that pulls waterlogged tablets out of shattered rooms and sun-bleached reliefs from scrub. Specific moments cling. Mercilii in 1595 battling Babylon and leaving the Kassites to pick up the crown. Telepinu ruling with a temper toward palace murder and putting succession on rails. Sapaililima, I smashing Mitanni power and installing in-laws as viceroys across Syria. The widow of Tutankhamun, writing to ask for a Hittite prince, and a funeral that never ends because it triggers plague. Mersili too fighting off Arzawa while wondering which god got offended. Muwatalli too moving the capital like a CEO moving headquarters to be closer to a market, and Hattusili III writing a corporate apartment. Blush. Kuduhupa sealing peace and reorganizing pantheons like a merger specialist. Tudaliaiv building dams and rock sanctuaries, then getting outflanked by climate. Sapaililiama, two fighting sea battles, while his granaries run dry. The last couriers, leaving Hattusa without a promise to return. The truth arrives solid in the numbers. Hattusa's archive crosses 30,000 catalogued tablets and fragments. The peace treaty arrives in 1259 Bes. The sack of Babylon adjusts to 1595 Bay in middle chronology. Uzalikaya's reliefs stride in the 13th century Bas. Kadesh's propaganda war covers kilometers of Egyptian temple wall and sits in Hittite files as letters, dates, lists of vassals seen at muster. Tree rings in central Anatolia spike drought near 1198-1196 Bar. Ugarit's last letters date to the 1190s. Carchemish, the southern Hittite anchor, persists into the 8th century Bas when Assyria flattens the region's independence. The archaeology stacks these numbers into a timeline that feels inevitable, and yet still breathes with what-ifs. Sources hold their weight. Trevor Bryce's The Kingdom of the Hittites remains a go-to for the political narrative, updated and debated but still ironclad on detail. Gary Beckman's translations of treaties and letters open the tone of Hittite diplomacy. Billie Jean Collins writes sharply on law and religion. David Hawkins deciphers the Luwian world that carries Hittite culture forward in the Iron Age. Payatracha ties religious strands into something readable. Egyptologists like Kenneth Kitchen and Ramesses II's own walls provide the Kadesh echo chamber. Scientific studies by teams including Sturt Manning bring climate into the conversation with measured confidence rather than fad. The primary texts themselves wag a finger at romantic simplification. The Hittites were not one myth. They were an archive. The sound of this empire is not a single battle cry. It is the whisper of styluses on damp clay, the creak of chariot axles, the crackle of cedar beams in a temple storeroom, the chant at a spring festival. The look of it is a king in a pointed cap stamping a seal, a queen with a strong jaw writing to a foreign court, 3 soldiers braced in a chariot swallowing dust on a dry plateau, a line of gods in Yazalikaya striding in shallow relief like a ledger of divine presence. Every fall narrates itself, as a moral. The Hittite fall resists smugness. It shows a strong state, maxed out at the limits of Bronze Age economics. It shows the risk in over-networking a world that relies on seasonal winds and fragile caravan routes. It shows climate as the enemy that never negotiates. It shows a managerial monarchy as durable until the spreadsheets turn to ash. The afterlife of Hatti stays stubbornly alive anyway. Luwian styles in the Iron Age keep telling local stories in a script carved with decades of practice. Assyrian annals mention kings of Hatti long after Hattusa lies quiet. Modern travellers walk Hattusa's walls, past the lion stones, squint at Uzilakia's gods, and understand why this empire believed it could hold the centre. The place feels built to last, even after it did not. The myth that the Hittites birthed the Iron Age fades. The truth that they wrote an early peace treaty, fought a battle that both sides swore they won, blazed a trail to Babylon, and made law and logistics the backbone of imperial rule stays. The empire rises with an engineer's confidence and falls with a storm that scribes cannot block. And somewhere on a shelf in a museum, a clay tablet that once sat in a Hattusa storeroom retains the fingerprint of a scribe who recorded a treaty clause about extradition that still sounds modern. That is a kind of immortality.